Hi, this is Mark Arnold with another episode of Fun Ideas Podcast. And today we have a returning guest, but it's not because we have nothing else to talk about. He has a brand new book called Hanna-Barbera, The Recorded History. And there it is. It's not pixelating out. Oop, there it disappeared. Whoa. Grab it before it disappears.
Oh,
Anyways, and Greg's holding it up too. So, welcome
like I
back to the
see.
show, Greg Ehrbar, with the 3D version, Dr. Tongue, woo, woo,
It's
of your book, Hanna-Barbera. That's a disclaimer. It is not in 3D. I mean, you can wear 3D glasses if you want to, but nothing will bounce out at you. Anyway, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I love Dr. Tongue's 3D House of Beef on SCTV, and I actually was a casting director for a while for commercials, and I had a couple casting for a bank commercial, and they made the mistake of telling me they were in Jaws 3D, and I said, okay, now you have to, because they had to hold wine glasses. Now you have to do this. So anyway, that's way off topic, but
Yes. To bring it back, did Hanna-Barbera ever do any 3D films? I don't think so, actually.
the
But actually, that is a good question. Even at MGM, did they ever consider doing a 3D film? I've never known them
I
to
don't
even
know what
do one.
Jerry have plans for one, but they didn't do a Tom and Jerry like Boo Moon for Casper,
Yeah.
and Disney did a couple of them. But Hanna-Barbera did. I mean, Hanna-Barbera under Turner did the Fantastic World of Hanna-Barbera attraction at Universal, which, by the way, was the first thing you saw when you walked in the park. It was there on the left, where Dick Dastardly kidnaps Elroy and Yogi. They go through all the different Hanna-Barbera, the top ones,
Yeah.
Yogi and the Flintstones. And well, actually, Yogi is helping them, and Boo Boo. And then the Flintstones, and then the Jetsons is the finale. And you can kind of see online, you can see the animation. I can't remember if it was Sullivan Bluth had done it, but the animation's really good. And they had a pre-show with Hanna and Barbera showing you how cartoons are made, in seven. And as you were in the queue, they ran uh, selected cartoons available on VHS, in the Hanna-Barbera store, which to me was as exciting as the attraction because it was beautifully rendered with, Flintstone areas here and all. That's when Turner put out all those great books, and
Hmm.
there were tons of VHSs. And then when you bought something, you got a receipt and it said Hanna-Barbera on it.
Hmm.
Uh, that was glorious. So I have a podcast with the same name that you've been on, and Mike Lyons and I did because we were both in Orlando when that opened, and we had
Hmm.
fun then.
Okay. But they never did a 3D film.
Not in the,
Yeah.
not in the
Yeah. After
would
all
be
that.
great to
Um,
do well, of course they were Jetsons was long after the 3D craze, but
yeah.
I would have thought, boy, a Tom and Jerry would have been a natural because of the kind of Roger Rabbitish kind of gags that they did. Having things flying around the theater would have
Yeah.
been, and it's not too late.
I know.
Not too,
It's like I'm surprised with all the various Scooby-Doo movies, they could do a 3D Scooby-Doo movie, horror movie.
you
Hint,
could
hint.
do 3D Scooby, or you could do it in a theme park where things happen in the theater, as Disney has done several times.
Oh yeah.
And the fact is, between Scooby and Tom and Jerry, especially, they're so evergreen. If you think about it, the history of Kings Island, and which is now Cedar Point owns, and Knott's Berry Farm is part of it, they've got Peanuts, and it's because Peanuts is so eternal. It's probably
Hmm.
going to stay Peanuts. Well, Tom and Jerry and Scooby seem like they're not going anywhere. So you're kind of business wise very wise to take a really eternal character and build an attraction.
Yeah.
So if anybody's listening,
So
uh, go
we'll see.
ahead. As my
Anyway,
mom would ahead.
back to your book. We'll reel it back in here. Okay. So
But
do you know, you probably know this person, Camden Spees. He's been on my show many
yes,
times. Yes. Yeah. He's a huge Hanna-Barbera fan. and he was a bit jealous. I have to admit that I got an advanced copy of your book, but hey, I said, well, Greg wants to be on my
Oh,
podcast.
no,
He needs
you know
to
what I thought?
bribe me. No, just kidding.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't know.
Mm,
I can remedy that. So I'm
yeah,
glad you, because I tried to have, and this isn't the book. This
yeah,
is which means it's not,
right.
we got taught an awful lot of things. It's not riddled with errors,
Yeah,
but it does have an index more than
yeah,
anything
I
else.
know. I was saying, there's
You know,
your index. So if you're looking for
yeah.
the full finished book, it's
Well, you
not done.
wouldn't, you get a flare pen and
To your own.
you we had the index my wife and I did, and try doing an index. It's not a fun thing, but it's a
No,
very, very vital thing.
yeah,
So the books you had were because the press, the University Press of Mississippi felt like they're in order, the pre buzz was necessary to do these. I'm
right.
just cover what the front cover was on
Yeah,
because I they did such a good job on the
yeah.
cover.
So anyway, we were going back and forth and he was asking me questions and stuff like that. But this is a good thing because he was saying, you know, why? Well, the inevitable question on Hanna-Barbera is why doesn't anybody write a definitive Hanna-Barbera book? And I go, well, there are if you put like 4 or 5 different books, and then now I will add your book. And I told him this because there's so much history you can't do a good job on the history of Hanna-Barbera with just one volume. I mean, you could cover it all and it's been done, but it's of varying quality. Sometimes people just get wordy and they don't really talk about anything, or the cutoff is, and we've talked about this before, a lot of people's cutoff is when Taft bought the company or Scooby-Doo came along or anything before the 70s, it's like, things like that, which isn't necessarily true because there's some great stuff they did in the 70s and 80s. There's some direct that came out then, but there was also some things in the 60s I wasn't terribly crazy about either that Hanna-Barbera did. But it's like, hey, it's everybody's opinion. Um, so I will mention by last name that there's a Hanna-Barbera book by Sennett, there's a
Mhm,
Hanna-Barbera book by Mallory, there's Jerry Beck's Hanna-Barbera book, and then of course the one by Bill Hanna and the one by Joe Barbera.
mhm.
And those are the ones I consider core books. They're all easily available on Amazon, stuff like that, or eBay or whatever. And then I will add yours to it because what happens with this book is it puts another dimension. All the other books either talk about their own personal lives, like the Hanna-Barbera one, or they're talking about the company as a whole in regards to the cartoons. But little is mentioned about the music. I mean, they might say, oh, Hoyt Curtin wrote certain things, blah, blah, blah. Certainly no discussion over whether Hanna-Barbera had its own record label for a while or churned out tons and tons of record albums and singles and da 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 in conjunction with all their shows and even used the original voice artists and all that stuff. So, I mean, that's why your book is essential to all those
Yeah.
other ones if you are a well-rounded Hanna-Barbera historian. So there you go. Those are my kudos for you on all
Thanks,
this.
Mark. And we'll be sending you freshly baked pies
All right.
from from
So,
when peach is in season. You know, peach isn't always in season, but
now we'd be remiss to not mention the other book you did with Tim Hollis, but that kind of led to this, I assume. So, uh, that being the case, mention that book, and then how did that lead to doing this Hanna-Barbera book?
the thing that I will eternally be grateful to Tim Hollis for is introducing me to the University Press of Mississippi and Craig Gill and Courtney McCreary and I'm sorry, I tried to get as many into the acknowledgments as I can, and I don't think I got everyone. So, and I tried profusely to
I'm in
apologize.
it.
It's a long acknowledgments list. You're in there,
Yes, I am. Thank you.
and but they Craig and I had many long conversations about the what book I should do next. And I'm sure you're familiar with the animation spin that I've been doing for I think it's over 10 years now for Jerry Beck. And as we speak, I just did a salute to Dal McKennon, which long overdue. I'm sorry I didn't do it sooner because there's a person who was in, like you said, some cartoons that are I mean, features Mary Poppins and stuff that are like at the top, and then some stuff like Bucky and Pepito, which scared me as a kid, especially that theme song. Bucky and Pepito. I mean, it sounded like it was recorded in, as Leonard Maltin said about, I forgot what it was, recorded in a laboratory. I think it just, with all due respect to Johnny Holiday, who also did other themes for Sam Singer, but and voices, but the animation spin they felt was as a whole was not specific enough, and it would get all over the weeds with that. You know, each time I would do proposals, he would say, "Let's go. We'll talk to the marketing people and all that." And he said, "Focus on a certain area." And I don't. And it was funny because I didn't. It didn't occur to me how much this would mean to me when I wrote it. And this is like over about 5 years. Um, I love Disney records, and they have a really special place, and you can tell from the way Tim and I wrote Mousetracks, especially the Alice in Wonderland album by Camerata. I mean, those are like limbs to me. Mm-hmm. But the Hanna-Barbera records are too, because they came out when I was in my formative years, and they bonded me with all the Hanna-Barbera things, because just like Disney, you didn't have video in those days. And when the show was done, you didn't have anything else you could read a comic or color a coloring book, but the sound was, and that's kind of what the point of the book is. And the book, again, like you said, it's not definitive, but it is comprehensive as I could make it, because it covers almost 100 years. I went from before they met to long after they passed, all, up to 2021 with the Tom and Jerry movie. Mm-hmm. Because just like Disney, they've got a legacy that's massively not only fun and entertaining, but extremely important to the entertainment industry, to history in general. Not just because of nostalgia, but because so much owes to what they developed, and their incredible team of people. The best in the business, and as well as the Disney people. And there's a lot of Disney in this book, because Disney was the leader, and it wasn't disputable. Disney was the leader in animated features, especially during his lifetime. And the pattern of Hanna-Barbera is like Disney's, at an extremely accelerated pace. There are major differences and minor differences. Yeah. And that's where I make allusions to the Flintstones as their Snow White. Huckleberry Hound is their Mickey Mouse, because he was eclipsed by Yogi, just like Donald eclipsed Mickey. Right. And the Flintstones was as vital to television animation, especially primetime, as Snow White was to features. And they were pushed into doing it by a brilliant executive, George Mitchell at Screen Gems, who was responsible for a lot of the shows we grew up loving, Bewitched and Genie and The Flying Nun and Hazel and all that. And he said, virtually they would stay in daytime and eventually maybe Saturday morning. That wasn't the thing yet. But they would never be contenders in the industry unless they went in the prime time. Just like if Walt Disney had not made Snow White, the studio would have continued to make short films until the 50s, after which they might have gone into TV, which Walt quietly did, and did limited animation, and if you read various things online, they did it too. But they would have pretty much been doing that. So they needed to get into the big, motion pictures get the major attention, primetime series get the major attention, good, bad, or indifferent, even if they don't succeed. And Hanna-Barbera also poured a fortune into those early shows. That's why they're so good and highly regarded, is because they overspent. That was the Taft deal too. And there's another book that just came out, Hanna and Barbera Conversations by Kevin Sandler and Tyler Solon Williams, that is it has a Taft interview by, at least his point of view about the Taft sale. And that's crucial to why it changed. But it kind of had to, because they had to stay in business. But I agree with you. I think that there were magnificent things done in the 70s, including what I think is one of the greatest animated features ever made, Charlotte's Web,
Hmm.
which gets a whole chapter in the book.
Yeah.
Uh, all a whole chapter. And stories I got from, I talked to several of the Sherman kids,
Yeah.
stories that made me cry as much as the end of the movie, because I had no idea how personal that score was
Yeah.
and how many of those songs had meanings to them that we didn't know.
Right.
And frankly, I wouldn't change a frame of animation. I think that is a pure Hanna-Barbera product.
Yeah.
It reflects an extremely overworked studio in the early 70s. And it is a story about life and death, and a story about existence, and a story about friendship, and a story about differences between us, and media frenzy, and the power of the written word, and sometimes how the writer is ignored, because Charlotte's the one who did it, but
Right.
Will the one who benefited,
Right.
and sacrifice, and lives of service to others. And there's so much to that story. And Errol Hamner, wrote the adaptation, and powerful score. And that comes back to what my original point was. And I know I do this, but I'm circling back. The idea behind the book is through the lens of records, because I was surprised, well over 500 records, either made by or based on or inspired by their work.
Mm.
And then ancillary things, like if you get an album by the Eligibles or the Randy Van Horn Singers, those are the singers you heard in theme songs and stuff. So I
Right.
have a few of those in there, not
Yep.
all of them, but just
Yep.
examples. But still, before you even get into that, well over 500.
Mm.
But it turned into something else, because Mousetracks was about a period at Disney that was never really discussed. It was listed and given a few pages of history in R. Michael Murray's very essential book, The Golden Age of Walt Disney Records.
Yeah.
But that's more or less a catalog, which even Disney uses, because it's hard to locate a lot of that information. It's not all 100% correct, but it's pretty darn close. We use that as a template. We use Jimmy Johnson's memoir, which I later edited into a book with Didier Guez, Inside the Whimsy Works. We use that as a template, and new interviews. But Disney is such an immense story, like you said. There's no definitive Walt Disney book.
Yeah.
Everybody has a different biography they like. Everybody has a different chronicle of the films. Everybody, there will never be a definitive Walt Disney book that will satisfy everybody.
Right.
But it's important not to read just one either, because that's where misinformation, especially on the internet, comes from. Because they all have a purpose to do. So in the case of Mousetracks, that was a like the period of 56 to around 78 or 88 when vinyl went away.
Right.
And that period is covered in a book about a little less lengthy than the Hanna-Barbera one, but we put history to couch it on either end. But you didn't need as much, because there's plenty of books that you can get that information from. And
Yeah.
And I also want to mention a gentleman named James Bond, Bohn, who also wrote about the music in Disney animated features for the press. And now he's got one coming out soon, the music in Disney's live action features. So it's getting covered. But Mousetracks is the first, and apparently the only, that covered the formation of the label and what it means. And to this day, what everybody there owes, especially Jimmy Johnson and Tutti Camarata, as well as Roy, for what is happening now, the template, just like that. But with Hanna-Barbera, like you said, mostly the books were gorgeous or fun, like Jerry's book with all the stuff in it.
Yeah.
Some of them had more text than others. The text was very good, but it was second in importance to the images. But they're nevertheless really good text, because I'm telling you, I used all of those books.
Yeah.
And they're all great books. And then the two biographies, which are two different people with two different points of view, sometimes that conflict.
Yeah.
I compare it to the Newlywed Game.
Interesting. Yeah.
Because they were very different personalities, and they saw history different. They saw people they worked with different, and you have to read them both to get that. But they were real important to this too. But there wasn't anything that told the history of them from the period until this book through the lens of records, but even more so, like you said, music, voices, and sound effects. You know a Hanna-Barbera sound effect immediately.
Yeah.
Even pretty much gave them to the world by the mid 60s. They were on radio stations and commercials, and they were in Filmation cartoons too.
Yeah. Yeah.
They were everywhere, and they still are. And it's like, a Flintstone doorknob, and
Yeah.
it's a car. It's not just the famous ones, but even the little ones. When you know the cartoons, and then you had these incredible scores and cues by Hoyt Curtin, and
Mm-hmm.
the less mentioned Ted Nichols, and then
Mm-hmm.
the musicians and who were not talked about, and the arranger um, for Hoyt Curtin especially. And I'm forgetting his first name, but it was Stein. I think it was, but he isn't mentioned at all. And he arranged, he orchestrated those, so that has a lot to do with it too.
Mm-hmm.
And then Jack DeMello, who was freelance in the mid '60s, a lot of his work on Magilla Gorilla and Peter Potamus,
Mm-hmm.
and then all of the composers who were subcontracted by Hoyt Curtin and trained by him, who went on to fabulous careers, like
Mm-hmm.
Ron Jones and John Debney, and people who, willingly say they owe a lot of what they learned to Hoyt Curtin and the way he developed that technique. So that's where it's like Hanna-Barbera innovated and doesn't get the credit. Hanna-Barbera,
Right.
they were too busy, as I say, to run around flapping their arms saying, we had a character voice department before Disney did, but they didn't officially dub it that. They brought in Gordon Hunt, and they brought in Ginny McSwain to work with him, and
Mm-hmm.
he quality controlled the voices from 1980 on, so you wouldn't have odd Betty Rubbles and things like that. you know and I'm hoping to have Ginny McSwain on a future podcast, because she knows all kinds of detail about how voices were cast. But Disney did it in '88. It's not a criticism of Disney. It's just like, people always say, well, Hanna-Barbera, this and that. I'm trying to, like, yes, no one's denying the shortcomings, but let's look at what the accomplishments were, and the stuff
Yeah.
that just endures, and even the stuff that may not be classic, but so many people remember or are going to rediscover on this new MeTV Tunes channel. How
Mm-hmm.
many people, including young people, will watch, and I don't mean 6-year-olds necessarily, but young adults and stuff, who will watch Peter Potamus and go, never heard of Yippee Yappy and Yahoo. It's kind of fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
And wacky races. I mean, you could just string them together and they'd be one long race. Every time you turn it on, it's basically in progress. It's like when
Yes,
you
it
turn
is. Yeah.
recording and it's still going. But
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't matter.
No.
It doesn't matter. It's there's something wonderful about the momentum of those cartoons.
Mm-hmm.
But part of that was the sound. Part of that was the sound effects. And Hannah was a genius at music and timing, visual and audio. Barbera was a genius at vocal, not just casting voices, because a lot of times he recast voices. He really had an ear for that. And we talk about that in the book. Stacia Martin has a Disney historian. A lot of Disney animators and historians have a great admiration for what Hanna-Barbera did. She said that if you look at the cast of the Flintstones, it's cast like a vocal group. Same with the Jetsons. You have altos, you have bass,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why he had an ear for that.
Mm-hmm.
He also, if you watch the 60 Minutes thing where and whether it's staged or not, he's saying you need to bring up the effects or whatever. If you listen to their cartoons, they had an energy level that television still finds really important. They knew they didn't want kids to change the channel. Hanna-Barbera sound on their cartoons, even the later ones, had an energy level that rarely, that kept going,
Yeah.
especially Wacky Races, like an engine was running. That was
Yeah.
Barbera as well as Hanna. So the power of those cartoons was, and part of the animation wasn't what you saw, it was what you heard. And the best example is nothing ever crashed on screen. You know, it always was off screen, but the music effects and incredible talented voice people were what a lot of people remember too,
Yeah.
you know, or quote. And that's kind of what the book is a love letter to. And that's what the records gave to me. And even the ones that weren't the original voices, of course, there's no replacing. But to me, those were like road companies, you know,
A good way
and
to
they,
look at it. I never thought about it that way. I was like,
yeah, well,
yeah, yeah,
I don't think many kids did not do that
yeah,
unless it was really really close. But it
yeah.
was near impossible. You had no reference material in those days.
True.
You know, I'm sure that Frank Milano wasn't given the 16 millimeter print or much less a set of them
Yeah,
of Yogi Bear cartoons. If
yeah,
he was caught a few on TV,
yeah,
and they had some scripts, maybe some boards,
yeah,
things like that. But they had nothing really to go on,
yeah.
and plus you're asking one set of vocal cords to be five of them,
Hmm.
or at least two.
Yeah.
One person has to be Don Messick and Dawes Butler, and most of us will never be Don Messick or Dawes
Hmm.
Butler. These were professional most of the time, and there
Yeah,
are
yeah.
others, but these were people whose job it was also to do cartoon voices. People like Lionel Wilson and Peter Fernandez and Corin Orr on the East Coast.
Hmm.
It wasn't like they were pikers. They were good at what
Right.
they did, but it wasn't what they did, and they didn't have much to look at. I have here. It's
Who
funny. This
show?
is
Show and
on.
tell. Show and tell.
I love the Hair Bear Bunch,
I do too.
and
Or
I just then because it was a throwback to the early days, only groovy-ized because it was the 70s.
yeah.
But there's a lot of the music tracks, and it was funny, and it was I just liked it a lot. And this album sounds nothing like the cartoon,
Nah.
but they it's a thing unto itself is all I can say. There was no
Yeah.
other Hair Bear Bunch or Funky Phantom album.
Yeah.
There was nothing on records of it except what Peter Pan did.
Yeah.
And these were New York actors and New York writer. Actually, a couple wrote it. And what's cool about it is they even created their own library music for these albums.
Yeah.
Again, doesn't sound like
I
Hoyt
don't think I
Curtin.
have that one. I do have the Funky Phantom one that came
Yeah,
out. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's core for Peter Fernandez and Lionel Wilson doing his. Um, let's see, I'm trying to think of a Terry Tunes character he did because he was Tom Terrific, he was Winky Dink. You
Yeah.
know, those are what you get from Lionel Wilson,
Yeah.
and he was also that Eustace on Courage the Cowardly Dog, but versatile actor, and a lot of times he was every voice in Tom Terrific and Winky Dink and stuff.
Mhm.
So he's used to multi voicing, but he doesn't sound like the people. So you just sort of go, oh, cool. They're not credited, but after a while, who they are, and you just go, oh, cool, that's who it is. But they're not them. Another album I dearly love is I don't know how we got on Fake Ones, but
Well, we can keep going. We'll talk about the real stuff soon.
this is the blue cover. There's a blue and a
Oh
red
yeah.
cover of
I
the.
have a story about that. Let me interrupt here. So it's like first time I heard this one, uh Dr. Demento played the first track on there, I guess, where he's introducing the Jetsons. I have it on a bootleg CD. Yeah, so I don't know the name of the track, but yeah, it's like and it's the who does the narration on that album? I forgot.
Um, I believe it's a gentleman named. It's either Gene Stack or not anyone would hear of, or two. There's two guys named Gene listed on here. I think it's Gene Lowell or Gene Stack.
Okay,
Uh,
I forgot who it was, but he did game show announcing as well. And but anyway, it was like the first time I heard that one, it's like uh it was I don't even know
oh,
how to explain it. It's like a bunch of drunks trying to do a Jetsons show. And you got to remember, I was like 10 years old when I heard this on Dr. Demento. And it's like, they're a futuristic family. And, it's like, and here's their dog, Astro. Oh, hi, Astro. It's just like,
Yeah,
what
it's
is this line reading? But at the same time, it kind of changed my opinion about these, you know, not properly cast record albums because I said, they're trying, they're making a living, they're trying to do something to entertain us. They're not really pulling the wool over anybody's eyes because they put on there who does the voices and everything like that. And they don't falsely say original cast, like,
oh no,
so it's like, yeah, you get what you pay for. But I remember being disappointed, especially on Popeye albums, that they didn't use Jack Mercer. But then you find
oh
out
yeah,
later some, were done by Alan Swift. Well, I like Alan Swift. Okay, wait a minute, and so, later you develop an appreciation for all these things, even if they're supposedly, you know, fake, for lack of
yeah. But
lack of
there's
better term.
an explanation that it takes too, excuse me, it takes too long to go into. Um, but the basic explanation is, before anything else, and this leads back to the power of the audio of these cartoons,
Yeah.
is they didn't know what they had because they were pioneering. Television was still pretty new when they got into animation on TV, and they didn't know how it was going to be taken and what it was going to do, and how Saturday morning even was just starting. They
Mm-hmm.
had no idea where it was going to go, and least of all, how attached people were going to become to the original voices. Because, pointed out Popeye, there were a couple of Popeyes, even in the Fleischer cartoons.
Yeah, Mercer wasn't the
There was
original.
at
Yeah,
least
right.
three.
Yeah.
There were several Olives. There were several Betty Boops. There were several Mickey Mouses, and both on records and in films. There were maybe only a few official ones, but before the character voice department, there were quite a few Mickey Mouses.
Mm-hmm.
Some people it was just a falsetto. Some people it was acting, like Wayne Allwine or Alan Young on the Christmas Carol album. That was him, but
Yeah.
it was just done that way. You know, and it was before people had continuity with these characters. You had them in theaters every few months whenever it came along, and no one was sitting there saying, or they may have said, it doesn't sound right to me, but not particularly. I
Yeah.
doubt it. Then when television came and they showed old cartoons, they generally threw them into a mix. But
Yeah.
you not only heard different voices, but you saw different eras. So they not only looked different, they sounded different. So I think you kind of accepted that too. But
Yeah.
suddenly you had Huckleberry Hound, Yogi Bear Show, Quick Draw McGraw, Flintstones, Jetsons, all of those. And suddenly they're in your house, and that we talk about this all the time, and we probably did too. You developed a closeness with these characters
Right.
that was unlike any cartoon characters ever before, because they were made for TV. They were made for all ages, but daytime it was kids. And you ate the cereal, and you sent away for the membership clubs and all that stuff. And so I don't think they knew just how kids were going to react, because recordings in the early days were all about cover versions. And
Yeah.
selling a song started out being about sheet music, then started out being about how many covers you could sell of a song. So when a
Right.
score was released on Broadway or in a movie, the song plugger's job was to get as many people. And if you watch State Fair, you'll see a song plugger. Their job was to get as many people, especially big stars, to sing the song. It
Yeah.
wasn't about soundtracks. It wasn't about the original, because soundtracks were not around until the late 40s,
Right.
and except Disney. So,
Mm-hmm.
Disney was always kind of a visionary and ahead of its time, but Walt Disney was.
Yeah.
And he was also brilliant at creating his name as a brand that stood for something.
Yeah.
So you saw a Disney movie, if it was Snow White or Pinocchio, that's Snow White or Pinocchio. But that held him in good stead in the 40s, because when you're seeing, much as I love Make Mine Music or Melody Time, you saw Walt Disney and you went, I know I'm going to see something of quality, maybe not that. And then it worked into the 60s, because when you watch a television show, okay, we love the Mickey Mouse Club, but Adventures in Dairyland, it's got an Ed. thank
Yeah.
goodness,
Yeah.
and that made it wonderful. But it wasn't quite the riveting thing that that 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea was. But what you knew you were in good hands with Walt Disney, even if it was a modest production or was made overseas. Um, I love the Monkey's Uncle and films like that. The Ugly Dachshund. They're not Mary Poppins. They were made virtually same people,
Yeah.
same
Yeah.
crew, same
Yeah.
director, even. But the Walt Disney name was powerful. Hanna-Barbera wasn't pushing their name as much or as well and didn't have the coverage to do it. Walt Disney
Yeah.
was that person, and you got to know him on television. Hanna-Barbera weren't on TV much. People are still to this day saying, "Oh, that's what they look like."
Mhm.
They were. It could have been a law firm. Who knew?
Yeah. You
It
touched
wasn't.
on, oh, go ahead.
I'm just going to say, it wasn't really till the '70s we knew as
Yeah.
kids. It wasn't
Yeah.
until the '70s that the name came up.
Yeah. You touched on something that was interesting. I didn't even think about this, but I knew it anyway, is uh, soundtrack albums, they would not necessarily be what was really on the soundtrack. I mean, the startling revelation when you get older and do lots of research on music, as you probably know, is like, when Frank Sinatra did a movie, he would do the movie version of a song and then he'd go into the recording studio, and then Elvis did that too. And it's almost like the Beatles spoiled us, because that was like the beginning of the changeover, which was ironically during this Hanna-Barbera time, that, oh, we want this same Hard Day's Night song on the record, in the film, live. What it has to be the same people, and they were able to accomplish that. So we got adjusted and used to, this is what it is. So you can't have anybody but Dawes Butler do Yogi Bear. You can't have anybody but Don Messick do Scooby Doo, or whatever.
No,
Even 30 years later, like say when Casey Kasem didn't want to do Shaggy anymore. No, you got to still be the guy,
yeah.
But yeah, and
No,
it's just,
I think his replacements did, and
yeah,
good Lord,
yeah,
Lillard has embraced being
yeah.
Shaggy.
But I'm just
On,
talking about the general public, not
oh yeah, yeah,
the
yeah.
problems of Hanna-Barbera. So, it's kind of funny. They fell into an interesting situation. And then, this ties back to your book, is that the first Hanna-Barbera soundtracks literally were that, is like taking actual, I think, wasn't the Rough and Ready album the very first
Okay,
official Hanna-Barbera one? So that just took the actual soundtrack. Was that the
there's
first album, or is it the
no.
Rough and Ready one?
I don't have Rough and Ready handy, but
Okay.
Rough
But I
was the
mean,
very
the Huckleberry Hound one fits too, because
yeah,
you took the exact soundtrack off the film, put it on a record, and you might have enhanced it with a couple bits of narration to explain a visual part. But
yeah.
essentially, it was what you heard, or what you heard and saw on your TV is now on that record. Yeah.
It was always, well. You make a really, really good point about pop music,
Yeah.
because the pop music that sort of eclipsed the big band era by the mid '50s with the baby boomers and all of that.
Hmm.
First of all, you got to figure baby boomers. The rise of children's records really began in the post-war era, when I mean, there weren't tons of them in the before that, but that's when um, Kukla, Fran, and Ollie were promoting RCA record players, and all of the great Capitol stuff with Bozo, Bugs
Those are, yeah.
Bunny, Disney. And Disney stuff didn't always have the original cast either
Oh.
on their records or on Capitol records. You had June Foray playing Pinocchio and things like that. They didn't quite know yet, and they didn't always have the ability. And many Disney LPs that Disneyland made, they either didn't have access to the soundtrack, or it was too expensive to use. But they also tiered their albums. They made Mary Poppins is the best example. They had the soundtrack, which was expensive, and that was your Christmas present.
Right.
But if you're in the department store and it's like, I want a Mary Poppins record, well, the Marnie Nixon one is probably $2, but that was good marketing, because you want to have a wide variety to sell more. And the Marnie Nixon versions, which were the Del McKennon Storyteller and the album with just the songs, those probably sold as much because they had the budget prices, or you got a book in the story. They gave you all of those up. To us collectors, we wanted all of them. But when you're in the store in the 60s and you don't understand that there's a catalog and things can be ordered, you look in the store and it's like, this is all I can have now. You
Yeah.
had no idea. And your parents even less so. It's like, quit bugging me. Okay, take this one. I've paid a lot how people buy records and CDs. And I was also told, and I think I put this in the book, by somebody at Kid Stuff Records,
Hmm.
that the sales manager, that parents buy covers. And so the kids, they're not as well versed necessarily in it, and they buy the covers, and that's why you'll see a lot of stuff on children's records about how educationally valuable they are, how high quality they are, how this PhD says this is good, and all of that, because they're talking to the parents. I love on the Hanna-Barbera records the whole thing about the Elefunken and the Westrex cutting heads and all of that. That's to assure people of high quality standard. That's certainly not for
Right.
children
Yeah.
records, but the record inside, I think you do kind of hit it on the head there. The pop record, the Elvis record, the record by a pop band. If Frank Sinatra records, uh, you know, um, this is always, I'm off the top of my head, or Stormy Weather or something, and Ella Fitzgerald records it, or Dinah Shore records it, or the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra. It's like I like them all. It's a cool song. It was the song as
Yeah.
much as it was the artist, and that evolved out of the big band era because suddenly the singers became free agents, and like Doris Day and all became artists themselves. That was not the case as much. And that changed and transitioned to the rock and roll era, where it's like, if I hear this version now, like some of Elvis's songs were, he recorded them second. I think Hound Dog was Carl Perkins. So it
Well,
isn't even that, but
well,
Elvis made,
definitely blue suede shoes. We'll use that as an
oh,
example.
Blue Suede Shoes.
Yeah.
Well,
There we go. Yeah.
well, and then recorded Tall Paul, but Judy Harriet recorded it before she did, and it wasn't very successful. But Annette became a sensation on television
Yeah.
without Disney really even expecting it. And suddenly there was this demand for her records.
Yeah.
Um, it was the public was changing the way they wanted to consume stuff.
Yeah.
And TV also became very powerful in that Ozzie Nelson noticed it first because Ricky wanted to be a pop star. No, not a pop star, but he wanted to be. He was a musician and he wanted to sing in pop rock and roll and all that. Ozzy was brilliant because the day after he sang on the show, the records were selling,
Yeah.
and that's still the case because once the Monkees went off the air, the Birds and the Bees and the Monkees was probably their weakest selling album, and they'd already separated into four pieces by then because
Yeah.
that's a album that each of them produced separately, pretty much. And then you've got the same thing with the Partridge Family. They made I think eight albums
Something like
total,
that. Yeah.
the greatest hits.
Hmm.
And the bulletin board was not as successful because the show, the and Tim Matheson even said this. He says there's a window of a
Yeah.
trend,
Yeah.
and you go through that. But remember KTEL, original hits by the original
Yeah.
stars.
Yeah.
You know,
And
and and you could buy knockoff albums for 99
yeah, I
cents.
don't know if I have this accessible. You keep talking.
Oh, okay.
Oh, here it is. It's right here.
Well,
Good. Good.
that's
Good. Good.
why they did it. They didn't intend to. I don't think they intended to you know make try to get away with something. I
Yeah.
don't think they thought it mattered as much as it did to kids,
It
and that's
definitely it
power.
definitely mattered by the 70s. And this is what I'm showing you here is The Last Gasp. You may even have this. Uh Ironically, it's by a big major superstar, but this is before, well, as he was becoming a major superstar, he recorded these, and it was Elton John, and he did cover versions of big songs that were around 1969, 1970. Now, he was doing his own album by 1969, Empty Sky, and his self eponymous album by 1970. But I mean, on the original thing, and it shows the original cover in here, not his big face on here, he's not mentioned anywhere. It's just big hits like what's on here? Traveling Band, Spirit in the Sky, Come and Get It, it's big hits of that time. Now you listen to it, and you go, "Wow, that's Elton John. Why didn't he just put this out as his own record?" Well, he wasn't successful enough yet, but it's weird. But they did this all the time. I know Vicki Lawrence did Christmas albums, those Firestone Christmas albums and things like that. Did
Well,
you
Vicki Lawrence,
see in the Goodwill, and things like
she
that?
was
But
Americans. Vicki Lawrence was in
yeah,
a group of young Americans,
yeah,
and they were spoofed on Saturday Night Live, the Young Caucasians,
oh
with
yeah, yeah,
the was the show with Ray Charles,
yeah,
and you can see a real slice of '60s, you know, um, non-counterculture world
right.
by watching a documentary about the Young Americans that was made for theaters in like '67, '68, and she's in it before she was famous, but she's still the wacky, funny one. And it is about this happy young people, all scrubbed clean group with white slacks and shoes and dancing on the stage and all that. And they were extremely popular, especially live. And they did record. In fact, Chim Chim Cheree, I just recently posted this on Facebook in Jimmy Johnson's book. One of the reasons Chim Chim Cheree was selected by the studio
Mhm.
to be the contender for the Oscars, they weren't sure about Spoonful of Sugar or Chim Chim Cheree, not Feed the Birds, but they
Mhm.
thought the most commercially successful ones, because they needed cover versions too. That helped.
Yeah,
Um, but Chim Chim Cheree was sung on the Johnny Carson Tonight Show by Johnny Mathis and the Young Americans. And because millions of people saw that, they thought, let's submit it because that's getting incredible, exposure, and it's obviously helped
yeah.
get a vote. So Young Americans is kind of that's if anybody wants to see it, it was on TCM, but it's on YouTube, I
Mhm.
believe. Um, but
So
oh, you know what? Speaking of the Jetsons, in its defense,
yes.
uh, yeah, the weakest part of it is probably the opening because the last thing you want to hear is that fantastic theme, with a small combo and a vibrant Jim Timmons style.
Yeah,
It's a light jazz sound that if you had golden records in the early 60s, they all had this almost cocktail lounge, a
yeah,
sophisticated New York club sound with a vibraphone and a guitar and a little, bit of percussion.
yeah.
So going from that nice big orchestra to like
Right.
it worked for Top Cat theme and the Yogi theme to a degree, but and then you're jarred by Herb Duncan, who did tons of New York cartoons. He was Muggy Doo, Boy Fox on the Milton
Oh,
Monster Show, and he was in a lot of Harvey stuff.
yeah.
But he was a stage actor. And then you have Rosemary June, who was one of the top demo singers for the biggest Broadway shows of that era. There's actually some CDs with her
Hmm.
singing. She sang the demos, and she did millions of commercials because she had a pitch perfect voice. She was sort of
Hmm.
like Roby Lester on the East Coast.
Hmm.
She's Jane, and she's not an actress so much because I'm Jane, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
like
yeah. Well, that's
here.
that's what made me say
Well,
it's not drunk, but that's the first thing
well,
because she
it's
didn't sound like Penny Singleton when she does it.
no,
She goes, "I'm Jane," and then the other goes, "I'm Jane." It sounds like she's had a few, and that's just her natural speaking
but as
voice, or
the
what,
album goes on, I mean, Herb Duncan doesn't do the best Elroy in the world, so who is Dawes Butler?
yeah,
But but by the time they get to Push Button Blues, that's a song that I could see Carol Burnett singing if it
yeah,
wasn't Button Blues from the Jetsons. That's the kind of song she would vamp
yeah,
it up. I got the push button blues. It's a great song.
yeah,
So yes, it's not, but it has so much to it.
yeah,
I always was forgiving when, like you said, they gave it their all. They
yeah,
had limited information, but they were pros that made it work. And if you went to, the Carlisle to see a tribute to the Jetsons with a
hmm,
small group of people and a bunch of mics and a small combo, that's what you'd see. Of
yeah,
course, that's not the show. And when you're 6 years old, you go, wow. I
hmm,
will tell you though, I did have the 45, and that's another reason I love Push Button Blues.
oh.
45 and, Ram Ram Zoom, and
Those are hard to find. I will tell you, any Hanna-Barbera 45 is rare. Maybe because
it,
kids played them to death and they got destroyed. That's probably what happened. So, Yeah.
Kitty records are vintage Kitty records are hard to find, and then hard to find where they can play.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Because
I
kids,
still to this day, if I go through a thrift store, um, I will buy a thrashed kids album because I know I'll never see this again. And if I
yeah.
do, and it's in better condition, then I upgrade. I upgraded a Sesame Street record the other day because I found a better cover, and things like that. And I know I could buy things on Discogs and stuff like that, but sometimes I just want to get a nice, cheap, playable copy. Anyway,
Oh,
yeah,
absolutely. There are some records, good Lord, the Mickey Mouse Club, the original albums, it took me years
yeah,
before ones I could even play because they were,
yeah,
and those are such cool records, but those were some of the earliest LPs for
right,
kids. So kids were not, they were loving them to death.
yeah.
There was the equivalent of what my little dog does with her lamb chop toy.
Hmm.
They played them and they threw them around the room and they played frisbee with them and all
Yeah,
that kind of. And so kitty records are notoriously difficult.
yeah.
Uh, and you're right, the 45s, the golden 45s, the HBR 45s, especially the later ones because they probably didn't press many. The ones with the kitty songs on,
Hmm.
the children's songs, the Secret Squirrel Presents, which also, well, that HBR is a whole other era of.
Yeah,
It
we'll get
wasn't
to
all.
that in a second. I actually want to just talk about the beginnings a little bit. I mean,
Yeah,
I read the book already because it's thorough as it is. It's not a very thick book, which is a good thing, and lots of good pictures. But and so forgive me if because I read about a month ago or something, and it's like I can't remember everything. So I know for a fact that because Hanna-Barbera had this distribution deal with Columbia Pictures, Screen Gems, uh, that part of the deal had to have been that if they're going to at least do those original soundtracks, they had to do Colpix or Columbia or some version of CBS Records, right?
yeah,
You know, and then
and
I guess anything else they did, Golden or Peter Pan or whatever they did, mainly Golden at that time, was you can do it, but you have to use different performers and different music. Was that contractually obligated, or is that just happen?
I think it was a little of both, depending on the product, because the Flintstones album on Golden is one of the best Hanna-Barbera records ever made.
Mhm.
And that is the original cast, and Hoyt Curtin doing the music. I think the Flintstones was very, very close to Bill and Joe.
Mhm.
Again, two guys who are nothing like each other.
Mhm.
When you think about it, Yogi and Boo Boo, Fred and Barney, Scooby and Shaggy, there is a correlation there.
Mhm.
Um, the that was genuine. The Magilla Gorilla, which was the last Golden Hanna-Barbera, is the original cast with a soundtrack theme, and that's
Mhm.
because probably they had more control over the recording rights because the recording rights are a completely different contract of that because there's no themes on any of the Colpix records
Right.
so, exactly as they are on the show. There's a
Mhm.
little bit of theme here and there or a sub theme. The Clementine opening to the cartoon itself is on, I think, Here Comes Huckleberry Hound, and that's up. But if you chronicle them, which I did in the book,
Mhm.
Colpix records got gradually more close because Rough and Ready and the Rough and Ready and the Huckleberry Hound, the first one I showed, those
Mhm.
have an organ on them because they couldn't use the music because Screen Gems owned the music
Mhm.
and they shared at the time the trademark with Hanna-Barbera. There was a lot of legal stuff there.
Mhm.
So they have voice soundtracks, but not musical ones. And as time went by, they got closer and closer. And by 62,
Yeah.
well, Top Cat was the music, it was right off the film. You can hear the film sound, on that. That's right off the film.
Mhm.
Um, and with no narration. And then the Pixie and Dixie, that's virtually the same as the cartoons.
Mhm.
Uh, Here Comes Huckleberry Hound is pretty close because that now they're getting some of the, but you got to figure this is after Loopy de Loop and after Curtin had
Mhm.
created some of the music. It
Mhm.
isn't the Capitol Library, and
Right.
that's a, and then by the Jetsons, that's like the ultimate because the Jetsons LP, the soundtrack album, is like is like incredible because it's the two first episodes, but they're perfect for
Right.
record. They
Yeah.
don't
So
even need a narrator because they're just perfection in audio. And this album also shows how like a Rankin Bass soundtrack, while the delightful as the visual is, they're very strong and in some ways a different experience
yeah.
hearing them as records.
Right.
But
That's what
that's it.
Chuck Jones called it illustrated radio. And
Every that
for
comes
my
up.
ear, that's right. Right on.
You
You
know
know.
what? Jerry Beck talks about that on one of the commentaries. I don't remember which. I think it was the
Yeah.
Flintstones one. And he said, whether he meant it as an insult, probably or not, it's also a compliment.
Yeah.
Because, and my comeback to that is, as much as I admire Chuck Jones, um, he didn't have to make the compromises and quality changes in his career, and he had a different career path. He became
Yeah.
Chuck Jones in the
Yeah.
60s, which was awful nice to become.
Yeah.
And he had still had theatrical deals, and then he went into specials. It wasn't the same thing at all, and he wasn't sustaining 1,400 employees and that kind of stuff. And also the How the Grinch Stole Christmas soundtrack album, which is only the audio soundtrack. The music was recreated. There wasn't a soundtrack till Warner Water Tower. Well, actually, Rhino did it
Yeah.
much later on CD.
Right.
That album won a Grammy. Well, you got Boris Karloff narrating, you got this great musical score, and that album won a Grammy for Best Children's Album, and it doesn't have a picture. So what do you call How the Grinch Stole Christmas? It was one of the best things he did after Warner Brothers. It's illustrated radio.
Yeah.
You know, the album is great.
Yeah.
So it's not really fair to say that, because one of the reasons the Grinch album changed was because there are a lot of visual gags in the show that needed scoring,
Right.
especially the scene with the sleigh.
Yeah.
That's not on the original LP because there's nothing to, you don't know what's going on without a
You
narrator.
just hear a whipping sound and go, what's
Yeah.
going on in there?
Well, Hanna-Barbera was the same way. If you isolated a soundtrack from one of their cartoons, even the primetime ones, the Jetsons holds up well. Top Cat needed the visual, which you wouldn't think Top Cat would, but
Yeah.
when he went into the maternity ward and Top Cat falls in love, the record doesn't tell you he's in the maternity ward. And if I was a kid, I had no idea why he was
Oh,
confused. Babies with ladies to take out drinking. I mean, it's fun.
yeah.
And she takes 5 bottles a night. I didn't quite understand that. Eventually I did anyway, but then when I saw the episode, he walks in and doesn't see. He's that's a visual gag, and
Yeah.
that's the art. That's the thing that unequivocally belongs to Hanna-Barbera's accomplishment. Primetime, especially in primetime, they
Yeah.
created a sitcom, and they managed at its best to combine visual and cartoonness with a strong soundtrack.
Yeah.
And I wrote about this, writing about the Flintstone, and we did a podcast about the Bertha Pebbles episode, the Blessed Event,
Hmm.
or the rehearsal, the dress rehearsal. That episode shows completely how it's loaded with visual gags. It's loaded with sharp writing. It couldn't be live action. It couldn't be live action.
Hmm.
There's too many. Fred brings her all the food in an instant.
Right.
Ralph could do that with Alice.
Right.
Couldn't just come back with the compotes and all that stuff. That's what sets those things apart. And that's what I think anybody who is in primetime animation will say. The Flintstones was the template, and we owe it all to that. So it's a lot more than illustrated radio, but things could be
Yeah.
a whole lot worse than illustrated radio.
Yeah. My thought also, and I don't know this for a fact, but it sounds like Bill Hanna and Joe Barbera were huge radio fans. They cast a lot of radio stars to
Yeah.
do, especially past their prime. They weren't on the radio anymore by the 1960s and the 70s, and so why not use them? They have distinctive voices, and they can get a new life, which they did on cartoon soundtracks. Whereas Chuck Jones maybe not so much a radio fan, and
Uh, some of the people that he used were from radio. Les Tremaine, who is so underrated. I mean, what a great voice. You know, he had
Yeah.
this, he was mentor on Shazam too,
Hmm.
but he was in Mr. Magoo's Christmas Carol, and he did many voices for Chuck Jones. He was a fantastic radio actor, June
Okay.
Foray,
Yeah.
radio. A lot of these people, now Janet Waldo was a radio star,
Right.
like Mel Blanc was. But
Yeah.
a lot of the people like Dawes and Don were mostly supporting players and came along when radio wasn't. I mean, they worked a long time, but Dawes was on stage. He was a
Yeah.
stand-up. He was in a performing group, and then he did Time for Beanie.
Yeah.
So and did the records with Stan Freberg, but he was on radio, but it was already kind of going.
Yeah.
Um, and that those people transitioned beautifully into TV the same way. So there was a mix of both, but Disney used some of the best radio people too. Werner
Yeah.
Felton, who was, you know,
Oh
Fred
yeah.
Flynn's mother-in-law, and also the Queen of Hearts, and the fairy godmother, and Bill Thompson, the Touche Turtle,
Hmm.
was the White Rabbit, and tons of voices. So they did mind that. That was before the era of using celebrities, though they used people who were famous on radio, like for
Yeah.
Alice. And Gary
Exactly.
Colon was much more famous on radio with
Hmm.
Bob Hope, just like Ed Wynn. He was stage and radio, but um, that's true. That's true. I think Hanna-Barbera gave fame to people who weren't as famous on radio,
Yeah.
and they did sustain the careers of a lot of people beyond that. And they started out with just a few voices per show. And by the late 60s, they were increasing that. And I think it's also because the acting rules changed,
Yeah.
because you couldn't double as much.
Hmm.
Uh, so they had to, you know, but if you look at the cast of like the Smurfs, about what, 50, 60 people on that show.
Yes.
You know, they're listing the whole, at least a group of seasons or one season or whatever. But even by Scooby-Doo and by like 72, 73, those voice casts got bigger and bigger and
Oh
bigger.
yeah. Yeah.
You know, and so yeah, I think it had to do with radio, but and you know, people were used to radio voices too, but they didn't make records out of radio shows like they did out of cartoons.
Yeah.
You know,
Till later when radio is gone. But yeah.
yeah, yeah. So it still was different.
Yeah.
Um, but the Colpix, the two albums that Dawes Butler was most personally proud of, the Colpix did, was The Treasure of Sarah's Mattress with Quick Draw McGraw,
Hmm.
and Huckleberry Hound of the Ghost Ship.
Yeah.
And those were original albums, no Hoyt Curtin music, just a little bit of needle drop music. But
Yeah.
he, Don Messick, wrote them, and they were the first time in audio they combined the characters,
Right.
because unless it was a comic book or a puzzle or a golden book, characters pretty much stayed out of the way of each other unless they were in an interstitial or something, or Yogi's birthday or something
Hmm.
like
Now I have a question for you. You held up the Huckleberry Hound album, and though I don't know my Hanna-Barbera artists. We mentioned Camden Spees. He'd probably know. Well, that's Pete Alvarado. That's this and that's that. Dirk Bickenbach and blah blah blah. I don't know my artists off the top of my head that easily, so I'm not going to go there. But what I noticed in a lot of these early ones, I don't know if you have the Yogi Bear soundtrack that came out on Colpix. If you do, it's kind of a childish looking, colored pencil sketch and stuff like that. And if
yeah,
you don't have it,
uh,
it's in the book. I'll show it to you here.
yeah,
That one.
yeah,
And it's like I noticed there was a couple covers like that that were kind of inferior. Is was there a reason for that? Was it an artistic style? I mean, even like this Flintstones one with the big steak is kind of
yeah. And it has
cheaply
the
done in comparison to
Betty, the hair,
yeah,
the right
yeah,
off of the model sheet Betty.
yeah.
Uh, that I couldn't tell you,
Okay,
except that um, I will tell you that the Yogi Bear that you mentioned is in Bye Bye Birdie, which was a lot of Hanna-Barbera crossover,
that's right.
and in the Telephone Hour song. It's one of the young ladies is on the phone. She's got a record player, and for this is a teenager, and she's got a that Yogi Bear with the sort of crayon cover on it.
Hmm.
Um, it could have been. I Here's my best guess. I
Okay.
think that the headquarters for Colpix was in New York,
Mhm.
I think Howard Burke, and I know who wrote a lot of the narrations and does the Yogi narration, was in New York. He ended up writing for television. He wrote Columbo and stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and I know that Hecky Krasno was in New York, and
Hmm.
his daughter wrote a terrific book. This is an unsung hero too. This is the guy who brought Rudolph and Frosty to records. Talked Gene Autry into recording it. He didn't want to do it. That was, I think we still have the Angel Stadium, so we can thank Rudolph partially for that, and Hecky Krasno. He produced the first Hanna-Barbera on Columbia. That was The King That Couldn't Dance, which I think I have, Andy. Yeah, yes, I do. The
Hmm.
King That Couldn't Dance is this. It had a book inside
Yeah.
that combined Gene Kelly with with the cartoon characters
Right. I
for the
found
book.
that in a thrift shop one day and I was in heaven. It was about 10 years ago. I didn't even know it existed,
Oh,
and
it's
it's like, is that the first Hanna-Barbera related
yes,
anything on record? I guess. Yeah,
yes,
okay.
yes.
That's what I thought.
There were a surprising number of Tom and Jerry records released after that, a
Right.
lot on
Yeah.
78, and some of them ended up on LP. But those were later. This was right out of the box with Anchors Away, and Hecky Krasno produced that.
Ah,
Um,
okay.
Kelly has a pretty important role in Hanna-Barbera history because the last Hanna-Barbera album was
Oh yeah, Jack and the Beanstalk.
Jack Talk, and so yeah, he kind of bookends that whole thing. But Hecky Krasno produced the Colpix records,
Yeah.
and he also produced like the Misadventures of Dennis the Menace. I think he was pretty much a house producer, and so was Howard Burke, the children's line and things like that. And so I know they were in New York, and I think that the sound effects on the Flintstones soundtrack album are not Hanna-Barbera effects. They have a little bit of a sort of a rise and shine that you hardly ever heard on the show, and that's pretty much it. That those two soundtracks are so good
Mm-hmm.
that you know it'd be nice if the music was there, but they're just so good.
Hmm.
Especially, I mean, the Snorkosaurus is great, but the big bank robbery with the no, actually both of them. They've got the argument in the grocery store with Jerry Mann, who's also the voice of Dino when he talked. I mean, all of that dialogue is so good, and then on the Great Bank Robbery is also just aren't we plural lately? It's so quotable. So that album is great,
Mm,
regardless of what they could not get. But I do think that those tracks were sent to New York and they were produced there, and I think that's where the art was done.
okay.
And maybe that was just not accessible at the time, so they just had somebody that could have been the art director's just rough for
Yeah.
the layout of the cover. It looks like
Yeah.
what they would do is here's where Yogi's going to be, here's where we're putting all that stuff, and
Okay.
maybe there's some time and they threw it out without it and thought, well, this will work.
Okay.
It's Yogi. That's my best guess.
Okay. So because I'm just kind of going through the book and looking at all the pre Hanna-Barbera record stuff, and it kind of goes a little bit all over the map. There's some
Mm-hmm.
gorgeous covers,
So
and then
did all
there's
the
some that are anything but.
everything
Eh,
they did though was all over the map. That's
yeah,
part of the delightful fascination. The
yeah,
every that's the thing. The records didn't get that attention, but Lord knows the merchandise did with Betty with green hair and or Barney with who is that? Who is the woman with a lot of that stuff again. They were going so fast. They
yeah,
may have glanced, but I just don't think uh, I don't think they they took the time it needed. A lot
okay,
of times there just wasn't time needed, and getting merchandise into stores was what paid a lot for the cartoons. And Colpix is they were very very when they rolled out, they started in like 58, and so the
right.
Hanna-Barbera was very important to them.
Hmm.
They had a pop line, and they were sort of the template for what HBR did, because they wanted to have a pop line, a mainstream line and a cartoon line, and that's what Colpix did.
Yeah. So, when they decided to go ahead and form Hanna-Barbera Records, was any of it having to do with quality control, or was it more of a just a natural progression, like Beatles doing Apple Records or Frank Sinatra doing Reprise or any other thing like that? What was the impetus to say we're going to stop sourcing this out to Colpix? We're going to, or was their deal with Columbia done? I forgot, what was happening that made them decide to create the Hanna-Barbera record label itself?
I think it was two things. It was like Disney, leasing out licenses didn't bring in the revenue that making them yourself did, because they wanted to handle distribution too, which was part of the reason they didn't get distributed as much, because they weren't a big label that had the reach of a major label. And that's still a problem now for independent companies who make stuff. How are you going to get in the stores? And so they depended a lot on regions, especially for their pop stuff. In those days, you could have something be huge in Houston, or Roses and Rainbows by Danny Hutton was one of their bigger hits. That was big in Miami. That's what they did then. They could do it. But that was the first reason. Second reason was that Hanna-Barbera, by that time, had already gotten into live action in like 63, and were trying to become an entertainment company. They still were not Hanna-Barbera. That's the thing, going back to Walt Disney created who Walt Disney was and what Walt Disney was early, and did his best to sustain that. And to this day, what Walt Disney is a very important issue. And what Disney is a very important issue. Hanna-Barbera were lucky to get Rough and Ready sold, and they were lucky that the shows were a hit, and everything was a gamble because it just was. And television was such an unknown quantity. And they were flying by the seat of their pants. And you can see in each successive show what they learned. That's the other thing is, with the Flintstones, it shows how the Flintstones changed. It changed for a lot of reasons, but the one season of Top Cat taught them something. The one season of Jetsons taught them something, and the one season of Johnny Quest taught them a lot, because that created the Comic-Con. I didn't create it, but the Comic-Con world we live in now didn't exist in 1964, and people didn't know what to make of that series then. But successive shows that borrowed from Johnny Quest, that they did, that everybody else did, and it grew. The idea of animated action for television, there wasn't a whole lot of action-oriented theatrical cartoons that were like that, really. There wasn't, maybe the Superman Fleischers come to mind, which were wildly expensive. They had to do it with a TV budget, and they stretched that to its limits. It was way too expensive. And so they learned from that. How are we going to do this for a Saturday morning show? But look what they did with Space Ghost and Herculoids. I mean, and Super Friends, later. Despite the glaring limitations of Super Friends, there are people online who are so excited that it's coming to MeTV Tunes. And they'll say, oh, we want Challenge Of, which to many is the best. Or, the Wonder Twins. It doesn't, that the technical aspect is only one aspect, but it's not the whole package. That's kind of what I contend here. So I don't remember where I was. Now I have lost track. And
well, I was just saying, was it getting Hanna-Barbera Records off the ground kind of a quality control thing, or were there other aspects at play, I guess, is what I'm really...
They wanted to, and actually Jim Korkis wrote about this years ago about the Man Called Flintstone in 66. They wanted to be an all-around entertainment company, making every kind of it. It was a young company that was still deciding what it was. Public response and financial response helped guide where it ended up. But out of the box, they were going for everything. And Man Called Flintstone and Hey There, It's Yogi Bear, which was somewhat successful, those were, okay, we're going to get into movies. Because in the 60s, it was more of an open field, especially for a feature that was made at a lower budget, because so was 101 Dalmatians and Sword in the Stone. They had to be, because Sleeping Beauty was so expensive. So a lower cost, and so was Gay Paris. that was UPA. That was not, you know, done on one's fluid, but they did something different with it. Well, that's what Hanna-Barbera was trying to offer too. They were still not sure where they were going. And part of the deal was, okay, we're going to go into movies. We're going to go into industrial films, tons of industrial films. Arthur Pearson, who's credited on the Flintstones, he was the head of the industrial and live action. And you can go online, and this is in the book, but if you go online and look for the story of Dr. Lister, that is a live action movie with a primetime TV B movie cast, all people, lots of recognizable people, headed by Richard Ney, who was briefly married to Greer Garson and was in Mrs. Miniver. So he was an actor who did a lot of, tonight's guest stars, a Quinn Martin production, Richard Ney, and a dear friend, David Frankham, is in it, who did tons of television. He was in The Return of the Fly and all that kind of stuff. And he was Sergeant Tibbs and 101 Dalmatians. Angela Lansbury's mother is in it. Oh gosh, John Hoyt. It could be an Irwin Allen. It has a lot
yeah.
in it all the way through. Sean McClory, he was on Lost in Space, and he was in Quiet Man. A really good, competent character actor cast. It's a 25-minute film that could have been shown on TV, but it was basically a commercial for Listerine. When I developed this topical thing, and it doesn't have the opening credits on it. The print that's on, but I saw it in a movie theater at a matinee, probably called Flintstone, because I went every time they showed it. And every time they showed it, more cuts were made in the bad print, and the song and all. But Hanna-Barbera presents the story of Dr. Lister.
Huh. I guess I've never seen that. I think I've heard of it, but I've never seen it, so I have to look that one up. So,
well, that was part of their diversification. They were trying that. So Hanna-Barbera and Bill Hanna did a press conference. It was in Billboard. It was covered heavily. They did a lot of print advertising in the trades. It was an all-around label, and they promoted, like Disney, which had Buena Vista and Disneyland. They promoted, the cartoon series and the pop series as well. And the stuff, just like some of the Buena Vistas, the stuff is real interesting and sometimes like, wow, what were they thinking? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Because they were going from one era of music and records to the next. And so there's rock and roll, but there's also easy listening and there's all kinds of stuff. It's all over the place. Then they made a deal. And so that was the idea. The cartoon series was for children. And the one that didn't say cartoon series was the Hanna-Barbera records. And at that time, Hanna-Barbera, as Fred Cyber told me, wasn't really branding themselves. So they didn't really see whether or not their name meant cartoons, even though to us it did.
Right.
But I think it was starting to seep into the public consciousness, because I think Paul Revere and the Raiders were teasing. I read in one of these articles, may have been Danny Hutton, about, why don't you put Huckleberry Hound on your drums or something like. And it's like, okay, Paul Revere and the Raiders, who have costumes on, and they're making fun. But I think that I don't think they really knew the effect they were having on the public mindset. They just knew it had to be a hit, and we hope we can keep the doors open.
Right. Now, as far as the Hanna-Barbera records that were based on Hanna-Barbera cartoons or shows, at that point they didn't do any just direct lifts off the soundtracks anymore. Instead, they were doing these mashups of, and I was just looking at it, but I already forgot. But it's like Johnny Quest does 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and you could hold up a couple. One of them did with The Wizard of Oz. One of them did, kids stories, Sinbad Jr. with Treasure Island and stuff like that, which I get. But why wasn't there a push for just, the actual soundtrack? It seems like that would be easier to put on these records. Or
well, here's
what were they trying here? Yeah, Snagglepuss with
here's
Oz. Yeah.
which is an excellent album. And
Oh, they're all
they,
good. I'm just saying it's
yeah,
kind of
and
interesting that they
there's
did this.
Wilma Flintstone doing Bambi, and
Yeah.
this is like 30 minutes of Vanderpyle goodness. I
And
mean,
like I said, I was talking about the covers. By the time they got to Hanna-Barbera, the cover artwork is incredible, even if the
yeah.
records were awful. But they weren't.
Oh,
But
please
the
no.
artwork was
The records
the records are great too.
are
I so don't quote me as saying they're awful. No, that's the best stuff Hanna-Barbera ever put out. But it's like
the records were completely homegrown,
okay,
um, and they were recorded at the studio. The songs were recorded somewhere else, but the people who made the songs and all that were based at 3400 Cahuenga.
mm,
The offices for the record company, it was led by Don Bohannon from Liberty Records,
mm,
and there were professional, recording people, A&R, all that kind of stuff, and sales, all of that. They were trying to establish an actual label based at the Hanna-Barbera studios. What's cool about them is two things. One is, yeah, there's no themes because by then the themes were still not licensed for
mm,
commercial use, except Magilla Gorilla, which was on Golden Records. You would get little pieces, bits and pieces, like the Touche Turtle album has a little tiny bit of the theme at the end. And I think it's different when it's a cue, yeah, than when it's an actual, song.
yeah.
So the songs are jarring at first to those who first start the record and hear, oh, my name is Super Snooper and I'm really super duper. I know they are rock, R&B, country, garage band, surf rock, Beatles type. Night, probably a 1 year. Again, these people were going from what was current when they conceived it, and then a year later, music changed because in the '60s, music was changing about every 4 months.
Right.
They were popular about a year or two earlier, and the performer, and they hired Danny Hutton to because he was young and he would bring that young sound.
Hmm.
What they did do that is admirable and interesting as far as the history of records is nobody was doing those kind of songs in 1965 on Kitty Records. There were a couple, and I mean a couple, of spoofs of the Beatles on children's labels, and
Yeah.
I mentioned those. One was
Yeah.
British, one was Golden, and
Yeah.
that's it. And even that Golden one was really not Beatles. It said Beatle Beat, but it was still bossa nova, and it was still a little bit not. And the Chipmunks did the Beatles album, and then Chipmunks A Go Go in '65. So the Chipmunks were ahead of the curve, but no
Right.
label. Disney did not do that. The closest Disney got in '65 was You Bug Me and Arlene on the Tin Panorama album, which you can download.
Yeah.
And that was the Eligibles, who became the Way Outs and became the Impossibles and were the Hanna-Barbera singers.
Mm.
So if you listen to You Bug Me and Arlene, it sounds kind of like Granny Sweet Granny. I mean,
Yeah.
it sounds just like that because it is the same people. In 1967, the same people, Al Capps, Ron Hicklin, Stan Farber, worked on the Jungle Book album,
Mhm.
which was Songs of the Jungle Book and Other Jungle Favorites by the Jungle VIP. That was Disney's first children's groovy album.
Mm.
That sounded like, nice, safe, kiddie pop, but it was groovy as could be, and
Right.
it sounded nothing like the movie.
Mhm.
That was 2 years later. Every one of these albums, with a few exceptions, had a folk, rock, R&B, almost soul sound, or was spoofing, like the Gold Pinky song, which I get a kick out of, was basically doing a Shirley Bassey. And they had people like Gene King and Ron Hicklin and all these people who you've heard for decades and didn't necessarily know it.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing about Gene King is she was in the Blossoms and she sang backup for Johnny Angel and many other songs with Shelley Fabre on Colpix Records.
Hmm.
So Records was Little Eva, and that was a soundtrack on the show. That was hoping to be a hit. And Carole King arranged that. So it's interesting how these things all weave together. These are professional people trying to figure out with real low budgets how to do kid-friendly pop music because they didn't have the access. Should we do what Golden did and do imitations? Well, we don't have any big orchestra to imitate Hoyt Curtin, and they did that already. Let's go with this sort of groovy sound that kids seem to like because they're buying pop. And on the Drop-Ins album, which I think is on YouTube, it's a very rare DJ album with clips from the first 6 albums and sound effects. And Huckleberry Hound introduces them, and he says, the new Hanna-Barbera cartoon series that everybody's talking about with these swinging versions of classic stories. So the idea was you either spoofed a story, and made Cinderella groovy, and she had rhinestone capris and ermine bobby socks, and a roadster to the ball. You did a dated version that was very 65, loaded with LBJ jokes, or you did a straight narrative version like Bambi and Wizard of Oz, which generally, with very few asides, Snagglepuss still said some funny things, but it was generally done with a completely serious approach that was pretty faithful to the book. And here's why they did that. You go into a department store, which they did, because all competitors look at what somebody else is doing, no matter what they say. Mm-hmm. And they went and they obviously checked what were the albums selling in the children's section consistently. And plus they have access because they did chart those things. Some kiddie records charted, especially in the 50s. Mm-hmm. Okay, James Bond is huge with kids. We'll do a spoof of that. The 20,000 Leagues, there was a Disney album of. The Treasure Island, there was a Disney album of. And those were 2 popular live action titles that got shown on TV and reissued, or one or the other. Alice in Wonderland, Cinderella, Wizard of Oz, Pinocchio, Bambi, all of those, multiple labels, multiple versions. What is out there? How can we compete with it in our own unique way? And that's why they did that. They got further away. Now, the albums came out in series of 6. So each one of them is slightly different, and the artwork actually gets more lush as they go. And among the last 6, we're in almost to 66, all 6 albums were based on the Adam Ant Secret Squirrel show. And they use the artwork from the title cards, just they put different type on it and stuff. And those were stories that could have happened on the show or were based on, like the Hillbilly Shindig is the Dude a Bear episode, only it's expanded, changed around.
So that's what I thought they would do from the beginning. Yeah.
Well, you would have thought that. And as a kid, the Pixie and Dixie Cinderella, an album very close to my heart. It starts as a Pixie and Dixie episode, and then it gets into Cinderella. Yeah. And I think part of that reason was, if you look at the Colepics of Pixie, those are 6-7-minute cartoons. How can you expand upon it? So you get a little bit of Pixie and Dixie and Jinx chasing, and then you go into the story, and then you get back to. So that was kind of the format. Charles Shows was really a segment writer. You'll notice Charles Shows did a lot of the early Rough and Ready, Huckleberry Hound, the early stuff. And he was great at gags, and he wrote a lot of very fun, satirical kind of stuff, because there's a lot of like light political humor in these too.
Yeah.
I mean, they're dated, and I think if they were reissued, they should be record store day kind of titles aimed at adults, kind of like MeTV Tunes is, because not only are not all the characters as well known now, but the albums are strictly 1965, 66, gloriously so.
Yes, yeah.
They wanted to be right on top target as far as they could, which is really hard to do, and also is going to date it.
Yeah.
But after a while, they went into more, offbeat titles. And by the end, things got downright bizarre with Yogi Bear and the Three Stooges. And then this one, which is really bizarre, this is one of the very last, the scariest, the most frightening album ever made. The Telltale, which William Castle does a good job, because he was kind of a ham bone anyway.
Right.
So he was very well suited to this. He was also doing deals with Hanna-Barbera at the
Yeah.
time,
It's
you
like
know, because
Hitchcock light.
yeah, it was like if you and there was an Alfred Hitchcock album on Golden.
Yeah,
So that was another thing. It's like, okay, Halloween, what can we sell? Well, we'll do this.
yeah.
This album is creepy as can be because I
Mm,
won't go into detail. I think this is on maybe YouTube too, but they Foleyed these effects because some of the effects are pretty grotesque.
mm,
And so there's no like, you know, a Flintstone effect for, well, I'm not going to go into it, but you know, people may be eating, but it is not, it is a creepy album. Maybe not the most frightening ever made, but it's very creepy. Lots of Johnny Quest music, but they tried real hard to have the music be not as recognizable so it wouldn't take you out of
mm.
the mood. But what's also cool is okay, the artwork is a tremendous piece of work, but it's
Yeah.
also Diaz, not Ron Diaz. It's the Roadrunner guy, the guy who was the voice of the Roadrunner. I'm talking off the top of my head here, and it's probably right on there because a lot of
Mhm.
these are also signed by the artist. Why can
Well,
I
it's
not
probably in this book, right?
in the book? In
Okay,
the book,
so if we can't discuss
he
it today,
was
it's
the
okay.
well, he was responsible for UP one of UPA's greatest cartoons, The Telltale. Paul Julian,
Oh,
The
Julian,
Telltale,
okay.
and he was really good at drawing horrific, strange landscapes.
Mhm.
I'll bet he did some of the landscapes in Alice in Wonderland, the desert ones on the unwinding road, because those were odd, surreal landscapes too. You know, these arid, odd areas
Right.
that, you know, he worked for Chuck Jones as well, and he probably did that for Roadrunner. But he also did some artwork for like I don't know if it was Hammer Films or American International, some of those horror movies.
Hmm.
So here's a thing that actually harkens back to like 10 years earlier or so or 15 years with the UPA cartoon. So the history of these are just infinitely fun to me.
Yeah. Now, obviously, Hanna-Barbera uh, wanted to kind of become a real record label, as it were, so they signed real artists. I actually have a few. I have the
You do?
Dynatones. Was it Pied Pfeiffer or something like that? Some
Yeah,
title like
yeah.
that. I have that one. Can't remember the other ones. Obviously, Danny Hutton did Roses and Rainbows or something to that effect.
Rainbows.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, I mean, did any of these? I guess overall, did any of these chart either Hanna Barbera or non Hanna Barbera? And if you know, do you know what the bestseller of anything on the Hanna Barbera label was?
Well, Roses and Rainbows was Danny Hutton's biggest hit for Hanna-Barbera. It got a little bit of plug on the Flintstones, and This Is Showbiz. He's actually caricatured at the beginning.
Hmm.
It was a regional hit.
Okay.
The biggest hit they had was "I See the Light" by the Five Americans, which is a pretty heavy rock and roll song.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah. I forgot about
You know,
that. Yeah.
and the Five Americans was I believe they were out of Texas, and just briefly, they this is where Hanna-Barbera's timing just wasn't what it needed to be
Yeah.
because they when they left the label, they went to another and they had a number one hit with Western Union.
Yeah.
So just like by about a year, they missed the Five Americans having their biggest hit of all time.
Hmm.
His last name is not Mitchell Ayers, Tom Ayers, I believe it was the A&R guy. He went to RCA and he signed David Bowie.
Hmm.
So, you know, there was no telling where this would have gone. There's no precise reason why it folded. I don't know if it was Taft or whatever. I know that they were really hard to find in when they were new. And when I saw them in the store, I went nuts and it was like, please, 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 please.
What just anything on Hanna-Barbera Records? Is that what you're meaning?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
You knew
Because
the
see, I
cover.
don't remember seeing any of these until the late '70s reissue in Columbia, which we can talk about in a bit. But anyway.
And at the
Uh,
sad is those got because Columbia was big and they also did mail order.
mhm.
Columbia got more coverage and they didn't do the covers were not as good by a long shot, and they were not engineered terribly well,
Yeah,
and sometimes really badly
yeah. The
engineered.
sound quality is.
The stereo was like flipped back and forth, like you know my dog did. You know,
So it's
and
just so. full down mono if it was, or just,
Even if it's
some guy
mono,
writing the levels or whatever, going back.
I sometimes I think sometimes when something isn't engineered well, it's because he didn't want to do this project. It was given, when you get through with this, you can do the stuff you want to do. And some
Mm,
people in the workplace only want to work on the cool stuff, and everything else is beneath them. That I've seen that.
mm,
My philosophy was, I'm here to do whatever you give me to, and that's what I do. But not everyone has that philosophy.
mm,
So I think that these were not the portfolio jobs. These were
yeah.
old kitty records of old cartoons. When can I get through with this? I really do, because there was no loving care. The best thing about them is that they were beautifully pressed, because Columbia records were made very well. So they technically, as far as them being clean, the Hanna-Barberas at first started out with a bit of grit in them, I think, and then the pressings got better. Um, they were still learning. Startup labels do that. Columbia
Mhm.
knew how to press a record and how to get distribution, and that's what they got. So unfortunately, these wonderful records didn't get the presentation they needed,
Yeah.
and they got, I think, probably it hurt them by being not the covers not being good, because the cover does sort of influence how you perceive the sound of the record.
Yeah.
And and then when you get to the record itself, it doesn't sound very good. And it also is out of the context. It was like 1977. It was much later. So it made even less sense to not have the original voices and have the pop
Right.
music.
Yeah.
It was sad, because I was over the moon when they were announced, and I got all of them,
Yeah.
and some of them sounded okay, but none of them, even the straight mono
Yeah.
versions, had the clarity
Yeah.
and brilliance that the originals did.
Well, I will tell you what I did when I saw those Columbia reissues. I was going because they always had a kids section in, various department stores like J.C. Penney or whatever, and Thrifty Drug or whatever. And then they would also have, the big chain like Tower Records or something like that, and they'd have their kids section. And I'd go through things, and I'd get to Hanna-Barbera, and I literally would go next next thing, because I thought the covers were ugly. I didn't know the original artists. Had I
Yeah,
known that, the original voices in most cases, I probably would have plucked them
it
all
does.
out of there, but I avoided them like the plague. I said, these are shitty, sorry to say, Hanna-Barbera crap from the late 70s. I don't want this. I had no idea there were reissues from the 60s.
Mm.
Until I bought one at a thrift store once, because I just said, well, it's Hanna-Barbera, I'll pick it up. And I played it, and I go, oh my God, it's the stuff on Hanna-Barbera Records. Well, why did they do these crummy covers? Why didn't they put the original thing and tout the original artists? And, I had so many questions and no answers. So,
I have I have seen that happen with a lot of things, to this day, and I won't go into all the specifics, but I can tell you with Golden Records, I was involved in two rebirths of Golden Records, and Golden
hmm,
Records suffered the curse of legal battles,
hmm,
and so they got pulled out of circulation, when vinyl was dying and cassettes were taking over, and became Wonderland Records, and they were barely even doing their early stuff. It was read-alongs and stuff, and then they lost several generations and vanished, and came back first with a company, that I did work with, and um, they reproduced the covers, and those are still being sold. I think BMG owns them. The Mighty Hercules, Woody Woodpecker, those all were ones I worked on.
those I bought too.
Originally, yeah, and I originally did the liner notes. Those are not around. Sometimes they are. When they get released as a CD, they just pick up the liner notes. Don't credit them. Um, Sometimes I added information to who's singing what. Sometimes, like with the Madeline album, I picked out the songs on the end, so they were reborn. Actually, I was involved in that, and actually, then again in the oh gosh, then they were issued by a company called Image Entertainment, and the covers were generic, didn't explain who was on them, barely or not at all. And they had these generic sort of Arthur Rackham kind of, illustrations, children's book illustrations. And unless you just, sometimes you had no idea which one it was until you bought it. So, I mean, if it was like Romper Room or something, it might say that, but they would change the title of an album.
Hmm.
And while the pressings were fine, they absolutely died. And
Hmm.
then a real cheapo company took a handful of them, did ugly covers, and they sounded crummy. And those barely made it. I think I only have one of
Hmm.
those. Then Shout Factory, when they were still making audio CDs, did a sub-label, Microworks,
Hmm.
and that's when I got involved again. And they did very
Okay.
nice. They did a best of, which I actually inherited, and I changed around, not only changed around the songs, but I put them in an order that made them play better than chronological order.
Hmm.
And I'm still pretty proud of those. There's a volume 2 and volume, I think Songs from Our Childhood, The Best of Golden Records, volume 1 and 2.
Hmm.
Notes for those, and we reissued the Hitchcock, the great Danny Kaye fairy tales ones.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Woody Guthrie, for the Woody Guthrie album, I actually located Bob and Louise de Cormier and asked them about it, and I found out things I didn't know about Golden Records, because who writes about them? My my point is that how many people, they don't know I'm out there half the time, or anybody is. They as Jerry Beck will say, they don't necessarily care.
Yeah.
If they do care, they don't necessarily know. Now we have an internet, so we may have more hope for
Yeah.
locating people who know. That's one of the things that this book, may help.
Yeah.
Uh, Pick up a phone. To quote a Barney Miller episode, you could pick up a phone and call a person. You know, um, rather than it being done poorly. Just
Yeah.
that it's done right. And the last company was in New York, and they did another best of, and they did some lovely things. They did best ofs with original recordings. Then they took people like Ed Asner and Reese Witherspoon and celebrities, and had them redo the vocals. So
Hmm.
you had Golden, and they're quite wonderful. But Verse Media, it was called. Virtually nobody bought them, because that's the problem is, you know, you got to have people know they exist.
Right.
And even in major companies that have this material, who reissue them, if even in major companies with reach, if they don't put marketing effort and dollars into them, they die.
Yeah.
And I can give you recent examples by big monoliths,
Hmm.
but they absolutely didn't tell the public they existed, and if they and they didn't necessarily package them properly and stuff.
Yeah.
It happens again and again and again and again.
Yeah.
It's a shame, because this stuff has an audience.
Right. Right. Well, we discussed this before, probably on this podcast, one of the other times you were on here, but so these Hanna-Barbera records, really, other than the Columbia reissue in the 70s and early 80s, they haven't really been reissued since. And I think
Well,
the one that I remember is the Pebbles and Bam Bam Christmas album did come out on CD. I snapped that up in a heartbeat. I was hoping that was the beginning of a reissue campaign. It wasn't,
again,
but you know,
I'm over the moon when that
yeah,
came out, because
yeah.
not only did they do a superb job restoring, and remastering it, they found two stereo tracks and used those,
Hmm.
and they also lovingly reproduced the cover and the design of the label inside the HBR with
Right.
the
Oh, yeah.
wave
Silk screen on the label. Yeah.
and the web page. They actually created a web page, and I contacted the person. Crickets afterwards. I don't know what happened to this day. I don't know what happened. Every once in a while, I try to seek this person out. Crickets. There was also a time when I went to Rhino, because Rhino had a handmade thing, which gave us the Josie and the Pussycats collection,
Right. Hmm.
highly prized,
Yes.
beautiful. I went to a meeting there because I had been working with Rhino on the Toon series and the Billboard Family Classics. I went in with what I showed you today. I spread them out on the conference table. I said, these are really cool. And the guy who was head of Rhino Handmade said, let's work on releasing two a month on a disc, two per disc a month. And then suddenly Rhino Handmade went into somebody else's hands.
Yeah.
It's a matter of know what happened there, but suddenly he wasn't running it anymore. And if you look at Rhino Handmade now, it's strictly mainstream pop and
Oh, yeah.
rock.
Yeah.
mainstream classic pop and rock. I mean, it's
Yeah.
older group, but it doesn't come near niche,
No
right?
Wild Man Fisher any
And that,
or Tiny Tim. Yeah.
well, exactly. When a label grows, it's
Yeah.
happened to a degree to Real Gone Music, which was doing a lot of cool stuff. They did the Groovy Ghoulies. That was one of the last ones I remember
Hmm.
buying. Mostly, it's become very, very much more mainstream. I was told by one label that does a lot of great soundtracks and did some incredible things that we're going for the Comic-Con audience. If it has strings on it, the soundtrack, they're not interested. They want action, they want science fiction, they want superheroes.
Mm.
And if you look at what gets reissued, it's usually action, science fiction, and superheroes. Um, Disney had Entrada, who was leasing and doing beautiful jobs. But except for those Callaways and a couple of albums that the great Ron Goodwin scored, it
Mm.
was mostly, and then Johnny Tremaine, it
Hmm.
was mostly, more of, it was the straight drama stuff. It was never, Parent Trap or Babes in Toyland or anything light.
Hmm.
And I know that they've released one in a while. And again, they're very limited by their reach. And since they are and their online audience is there, I
Hmm.
think that's who they're feeding to stay in business. I'm not saying they've done anything that they shouldn't do. I'm just saying that that's kind of what happens as something grows and you have more responsibility to that growth.
Yeah.
You got to go where the business is and where the money is. Um, I still think a niche label could take these and or even a division of a niche label, take these, reproduce them in vinyl with the
Mm.
original and sell them on record store day because that
Right.
stuff vanishes. Can you ever find the records you want on record store day? No,
No.
because they're gone immediately.
Yeah.
And usually it's dealers, because they have to limit them. I've
Well,
waited in many lines on record store day.
yeah.
I've
I
been
found a
lucky.
few, but I mean, one I can think of is I wanted the Lurch 45 because, the
Yeah,
original cost, a couple $100. Well,
yeah,
now that replication costs a couple $100. It's like, I might as well buy
yeah.
an original, you know?
The At Home with the Munsters was reissued on vinyl, and I didn't even know it.
Yeah.
And I was curious, but nothing else came of it. And that was, I mean, if I didn't know it and I didn't see anybody mention it online, then a lot of people didn't,
Yeah.
and it was a highly prized one too. And I don't think that was record store day. Dark
No.
Shadows was.
Yeah, that was just a regular release. But
Yeah,
still, these regular releases just kind of slip out there and you're like, huh? Huh?
it's a
Oh,
crowded place, and it's even more crowded now. It's hard for anything to get through all of the.
excuse me.
It takes care, ingenuity, money, and it also doesn't necessarily take money if you have good, like Warner Archive, good strategy, good contact with the public, and good nowadays a really competent SEO online specialist.
Yeah.
There are tons of them out there, and I think a lot of people put a lot of trust in some, but
Mm.
it's the same thing. If they don't have passion behind this, they're going to want the stuff that, I've been in organizations that it's like it's all about the influencers and all this stuff, and
Yeah.
it's like, okay, that's good if it's going to be certain items, but not this. And that audience, we know them, we know they're there, and there's
Maybe
more we don't see, you
maybe
know.
there'll be a Me TV Tunes record label. No, I don't know. Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah,
Uh,
well, in dream. Do you have dreams where you go
I
to the
have
comic
dreams.
store and
Yes.
and the original like Archies are still being made the way they used to look, or
Yeah,
to
yeah.
these, or you go to the record store and it's like, I find Disney albums that I don't even remember when this was made. I got to get back to this store before it's gone, and then I
Right,
have
right.
later dreams where I'm trying to get back to that store where they had that Winnie the Pooh album that never, and all these people. Yeah, yeah, I do too. I
So who owns the copyrights to these
Warner
records?
Warner
So,
owns
okay.
virtually anything with their characters. They own. I know they have all of the HBRs. They have the Golden, the McGilla Gorilla, and the Flintstone one.
Okay.
And by rights they own. They may, if they're on another label, which most likely isn't the original cast. You know, there were three Scooby Doo's that Peter Pan did
Mm.
with the original cast, minus one on the first one. Casey Kasem came on the second and third one,
Well,
and they're not bad. You know, they're the fact that they did it is
yeah.
quite wonderful. You know, you
Well,
got Heather North. How many Heather North records are there? Or Pat Stevens, or even Frank Welker. Frank
yeah.
Welker didn't make a whole lot of records, you know, so it's glorious just to hear them doing it, you know.
Well,
And
if Warner owns it and they do Warner Archive for movies, why can't they do that for soundtracks? Or they don't think there's a market for that?
well, they, for the same reason that Warner Archive used to partner with TCM to do MGM soundtracks, and I guess it just after a while kind of slowed down because
Yeah,
in the '90s when there was the boom of everything coming out on CD with extended tracks and all this stuff,
yeah,
that's when really the Warner Archive really began. That's when
yeah.
it was experimented with, and the stuff that was on Rhino then, of MGM stuff, that was George
Yeah.
Feltenstein
Oh, okay.
and people like Robin Frederick, who I worked with, and you know, and she also produced stuff, some of the Hanna-Barbera stuff, and then Earl Kress, of course, who
Hmm.
was responsible for most of what we were able to get, you know,
Hmm.
really more than we ever had of real Hanna-Barbera stuff was because of Earl and because of Fred Seibert saying, what can we access now? And he was like, hey, and he said, do it. And Fred Seibert was very proud of the fact that this stuff happened.
Hmm.
And it's not available. None of that's available anymore. The Hanna-Barbera Christmas album is available for download, but the themes are nowhere to be found again. Legitimately,
Yeah.
they're all knockoffs. There is a lovely British. They did about six themes, and they're in stereo. And the Top Cat is
Hmm.
really great, and the Smurfs is great too. Um, the others are good, but
Hmm.
those are the closest that you can get to it. The TV Tunes albums, I think they're long out of print.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
I
so
mean,
we're
I
back.
have all this stuff, so I'm not worried about it. It's just that it's funny how they didn't kind of strike while the iron was hot in the 90s. I thought that would be the perfect time for all these things to come out, and they just never did. You know, it's like,
No,
oh
no,
well,
it, but as I just told you, we missed it by that
I
much.
guess that's what it was. You know, and I mean,
What's gonna happen?
it makes me wonder how many other stories are like this about other archives and labels and things that could have come out.
Well,
Because I mean, there's Mad Magazine
oh,
albums that have never come out on CD. What other, it's
well, there's
like,
a lot of soundtracks that still aren't on CD. Like, I mean, Doctor Dolittle was reissued just the same album, but the extended one that La La Land did, that's fairly recent. That was
yeah,
only about 6 or 7 years ago, and that's tremendous. And that was a long time waiting. You know, a lot of these musicals had much more music than would fit on an LP, and there's no Oliver, there's no Scrooge, there's no 1776. Um, there's quite a few, and then a boy named Charlie Brown. That was very briefly, I think contractually was very only 1,000. I think were made, and they came and gone. And you're sometimes I'm too late. You know,
yeah.
sometimes I'll read on Wikipedia that a soundtrack was available in like 2006 or something. It's like, well, that's going to be $150.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I mean, I'll say ones that you've worked on, those Rankin Bass ones we talked about last time. I mean, it's like I missed the boat on those, at the time they were made, and it's like, I think you worked on, right?
I didn't
The
rank.
Frosty one, or was
I
that Rick
worked
Goldschmidt?
well, he consulted on them.
Okay.
The legitimate ones. Mad Monster Party still has not been
Okay. No,
officially,
I'm talking about legit, yeah.
but
So
the Santa Claus is Coming to Town and Frosty the Snowman was,
yeah,
and
that one. I missed it.
and here's another thing: the Daydreamer and the
Yeah.
Wacky World of Mother Goose, they
Yeah.
were registered, and Sony put them online, so you can
Oh,
actually get them now.
oh,
Um,
okay.
that's kind of great because Daydreamer is a great soundtrack, but it never
Although I
made.
do have the DVDs at least, so on those. So, but yeah.
but not. And I'd love to see Hey There, It's Yogi Bear done. You know, I mean, and maybe they fix St. Louis in stereo because
Yeah.
and opening because there's
Well, there
some.
would be a perfect example. They just recently put Hey There, It's Yogi Bear on Blu-ray at the Warner Archives. How hard is it to put a CD soundtrack as a second disc? I mean, is it that difficult? George Feltenstein? Anyway.
I it's more money. It's going to be more money because
Yeah.
recordings involve licenses
Yeah.
and fees
I'm
paid to
sure
you.
it's more complicated. Yeah.
I have a story in Mousetracks about, or maybe it's in the Whimsy Works when Fantasia first came out on LP in like '57, and then it was '58. It was stereo.
Mhm.
Leopold Stokowski was, I think, at his pool or something at a hotel, and Johnson came out to get him to sign a contract. He said he would only give his permission if the musicians were given, back payments, and they did.
Hmm.
So those kind of things, it's like the same with Alice in Wonderland. The soundtrack to Alice was until like '97.
Right.
And that was a massive amount of cost and legal time piecing out, all of that because it was never it was licensed for Decca. Decca let it lapse, never was available. Movie was not all that successful. It's become a classic and it's highly revered now.
Right.
And Disney was doing so well with Lion King and Beauty and the Beast and all. That was the second golden era for Disney records too,
Hmm.
because in the '90s suddenly Randy Thornton is like putting out all of these full soundtracks of Snow White and Pinocchio and Bambi, and it was like, wow, what a gold mine! All of and extended Mary Poppins and all of that stuff, and
Yeah.
that's so important because it's really vitally important because we always take for granted that all this stuff is going to be accessible to the technicians and engineers. And if you watch TCM and you hear them talk about the film elements being hard to find, it's the same with audio.
Yeah.
Um, one of the producers of the MGM series was Marilee Bradford, and she told me that the Gigi elements, the audio elements, were literally um, uh, uh, dematerializing as they came off processing machines. Had they not got the Gigi when they did, they wouldn't have been able to. And there's still stuff that's they were never truly cared for, or they were hard to find, or the boxes were mislabeled. You hear that all the time, and it's not always all that long ago with some things. So it's people like George and like Randy and like these people, they fight an uphill battle because it's always difficult to convince not always, but it's difficult to convince the
Right.
here and the now where they've got an initiative that's here and now.
Yeah.
This thing that might be successful or might have evergreen, use is worth putting funds to. And then you've got finance people who have to approve it. It's not as easy as it sounds, and
Right.
you want to do a bootleg, and a lot of times a bootleg. I mean, there are okay bootlegs, and then there are,
Hmm.
boot that's like my vinyl sounds better.
Right. Right. Um, Continuing the Hanna-Barbera story. So Hanna-Barbera Records folds in '67, I guess. We type was that planned? Was that like, oh, we'll go out with Gene Kelly's album, or is it just the one that happened to be the one released and then we're done?
I doubt it. I know that from what I researched is that the Don Bohannon was very disappointed, and I don't know if he went back to Liberty, but it is probably not a coincidence that Hanna-Barbera signed a deal with Liberty right after.
Yeah, and I was
They,
going to ask you about that. The Shazam record and is
yeah,
a Flintstones one. Show those if you have those. Yeah.
yeah. What's cool
Um,
is
those look like they could have been on Hanna-Barbera Records
yeah.
just with Sunset labels on them. Yeah, especially that
Well,
one. Yeah.
they
Yeah.
they made for Liberty, but what's cool about it is it's the Shazam title card, just like they were doing
Yeah.
before.
I'll
It's
pull it
this
down a little bit. There we go. Okay.
you know
Okay.
with changes in the type and in the overall design, but it's the same. And what's also cool about they only did two for Liberty Sunset,
Yeah.
is that their original albums with stereo sound and original scores, and in the case of the Flintstones Meet the Orchestra family, really good songs that John McCarthy wrote, who wrote the Christmas Flintstone songs and several of the Man Called Flintstone songs,
Hmm.
and a ginormous orchestra headed by Ted Nichols. So it has that traditional Jetson jazz sound
Right.
that I much in strings and everything. It's a lavish album. Shazam has almost that level, but it has the completely full cast. One of the stories comes from the show, The Evil Genie of Masira, and the other one is an original.
Hmm.
And plus, it has songs, and you hear Janet Waldo kind of singing, which really sing well. And Jerry Dexter, again, another Hanna-Barbera staple who didn't do many records, because in the 70s there were very few. But here he is on this record. I think that was going to happen, but then look at it, 1968. You
Yeah.
couldn't find a Chipmunk album. I mean, the last few,
Yeah.
Dr. Dolittle and Chipmunks Go to the Movies, hard to find them. They
Yeah.
were available as a kid. I didn't know till 1970 there was such a thing as a catalog
Yeah.
where all the Chipmunks albums were available and you could order them by mail, but the stores weren't stocking them.
Yeah. I think Liberty was in really bad shape by that point
But
anyway. So, and then
it was
they folded
UA.
into UA. Yeah. And
They, they became United Artists. And
yeah.
what they did with Hanna-Barbera in 67, 68 was they took all of the existing HBR records. They didn't make new ones. They just took the cellophane off, and sometimes not, and just slapped the black sunset label
Oh,
over the.
wow. Okay.
That was all they did.
I have not
And
seen those. I've seen them on Chipmunks records. I have not seen them on Hanna-Barbera records. So that's interesting. Yeah.
and that's the only way. And I buying them secondhand. I never saw them. Maybe I saw them in cutout racks that way, but that was about it.
Hmm.
But at least on the East Coast, they were always only in certain stores. And then once they got discontinued, that became my singular treasure hunt through my childhood and teenhood is finding Hanna-Barbera records because it was so impossible. Every store I saw that might have had records in it, it was like maybe there's one in there. It was
Yeah.
possible.
Yeah.
That was the dream. And then when
Hmm.
eBay came, and I did find them little by little, going to record shows. My wife, it's funny that one of the running jokes at my office at Disney was that my golden what do you call it? Your golden the Holy Grail was the Three Stooges and Yogi Bear and the Man and
Hmm.
Dr. Chrono.
Hmm.
And I mean, I won't go into detail, but it was worked into other things as time went by. That was the thing I was after. And guy I worked with, Dennis Shalafor, he said if you had a time machine, you'd probably go back and in time find that album. And if you were at the grassy knoll, it's like, so young man, I guess you're looking for the Yogi Bear and the yeah, everything else, yeah, as long as I could find that. Of course, that was 63 and this was six, but nevertheless, yeah, I was teased. I was teased as a kid. Most of us into this stuff was, but when as an adult, it was done with a great deal of fun and affection. But I was unapologetically looking for that. And so when we found it at a record show with
Yeah.
those deals, I was like an idiot, would go saying I was looking for them. And like one guy had a Quick Draw McGraw album, sold it to somebody else, and then he sold it to me for more because I was such a moron. I learned my lesson. Don't be obvious. So when I saw that, I had to contain my unbelievable joy. And fortunately, my wife was with me to play bad wife, to say, you can't have that. We don't have the money.
Bad wife.
And I'll never forget that she was there to like be it's like when you're buying a car,
Hmm.
you have either the husband or the wife being the one, we're going to walk. So the guy did charge me a fortune for it. But that was nice. But yeah, that's kind of what happened. And then in 77, we didn't really see them again. Now, you mentioned them being reissued. Besides Pebbles and Bam Bam, the Five Americans that I showed you was reissued on a legitimate CD and was given tiny, mention that what label it was on. And this one was reissued.
Yeah, when I made the reference, I was mainly talking about the cartoon records, not all the
Well, that's
other stuff. But yeah,
right.
yeah,
You're exactly right. None of them were reissued as they were on CD. The only other one was the Golden Hits of Louis Prima, which I'm assuming his family owned the rights to,
probably.
because
Yeah.
they issued on his own private label with the same cover, and that's kind of cool. Um, the one I think would really do well on Record Store Day, is and when Charlotte's Web
Well,
was
heck, the Three Stooges one would do well on Record Store Day.
of course it would, of
But
course it
can I tell you mine? You'll get jealous. You'll get
what
jealous. My
what
story on the Three Stooges record. So I never knew about it until Jeff Lindbergh and Joan Howard Moore's book, The Three Stooges Scrapbook. I didn't know about any Stooges records. And then, oh, I go, wow, Yogi Bear and the Three Stooges. That's great. I got to find this thing. So that book came out in 1983, and I said, maybe they'll put it out on CD. I was young and naive. I figured everything would come out on CD. Never did. I probably found it about 2003, maybe, so we're talking 20 years later. So I've had it for a long time, just in a record store. And it wasn't priced too high. It was like $10. It's
I
perfect
know, isn't
condition.
it lucky when they're like they don't know, and it
Yeah,
happens on eBay rarely because
yeah,
a lot of people just sit on stuff at an
yeah.
exorbitant price for years.
And it was in mint condition. It was like the person who got it probably played it once and just said, and held
Yeah,
on to it and then sold it to the store because of the record store I frequented regularly and I still go to when I travel back to California, Streetlight Records. And $10 was high for a children's record for them because most of their children's records used were like $3 and $4 and still are. But they knew the value of Three Stooges, so hey, we'll boost it up to 10. So anyway, that's my story. Not to brag, but yeah, that's what I got it for. And it's like, but I've never seen it since. So
what's hard? It's hard to this
yeah,
this Charlotte's Web was reissued. It took a long, long time. And as you may have read on Facebook, it also, just like Paramount being a challenge to get a lot of those cartoons. It was a challenge with this. This is on Paramount Records originally. It was reissued on a picture disc shortly, like in the late 70s when picture discs became popular, but they just threw it in a plastic thing and no cover. This is
I
very
do have the
Sarah.
Paramount one. I don't have that reissue, but I remember when that came
Yeah,
out.
this
Yeah,
is this is very Sarabands. And the thing is that the thing about the Charlotte's Web album is because it had the little pop-up farm, the glue that they used to make the pop-up farm stick to the album was somehow abrasive. And so there was always a on just about half an inch of the vinyl.
yeah.
So I had to spend years finding one where side one was exposed to that, and then side two was, so that I had two good sides. Because almost every one of them, perhaps of the original issue, is a little
I'll have
slightly.
I'll have to
But
look at my copy again because I thought mine was fine, but it's
well,
been years since.
maybe yours is.
Uh,
These two would be very, very likely to get reissued. The Globetrotters,
I have
which
that. Yeah.
on our this is the English version, which has more of the cartoon
Oh, it
characters
doesn't
on it.
have the gatefold thing.
Yeah,
Oh,
and
interesting.
and this is great because it has some of the greatest uh, uh, musicians and singers on it,
Yeah,
uh, and also and has been written about elsewhere
yeah,
because of history.
yeah.
And Don Kirshner produced that one.
Let me talk
One,
about that era for you. And you're
yes,
about to
please,
pull up another one. So we're talking 68 to like 73. And
yeah.
this is after the Hanna-Barbera records. But strangely enough, I think Hanna-Barbera had its greatest success at this point in a certain respect with Banana Splits. Maybe less or so with Globetrotters. Definitely let it, yeah, because didn't that sell pretty well? The Banana
It
Split
might
song?
have, because I did see this one got in a lot of stores.
Yeah,
Was very. I mean, that's kind of what I. Sometimes you never saw the album.
yeah,
That one I saw a lot. Plus, they released a single, and they also had that those two records from the serial.
yeah.
Which
And they
don't.
charted the Long Live Love, I think charted wasn't like number 95. I mean,
Yeah,
it
so
wasn't a big hit, but hey, that's better than some of these things. So, they actually get on the Billboard charts. So, you know,
well, and if you
so
again, if you listen to that album and don't think about it being the Banana Splits, it's a 1968 R&B album to the. I mean, there's a
Yeah.
happy little like instrumental, the toy piano melody that sounds very curtainish, even though it's not. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but it, well, maybe he arranged it, or maybe Jack Stein arranged it. That's who I was
Mm-hmm.
trying to think of. But for the most part, a lot of these songs are, doing the Banana Split, which was on the show a lot,
Yeah.
which Barry White that's a pretty, for a children's song on a cartoon show, nobody else was doing that. They were really
Right.
trying to say, and then you had Chattanooga Cats.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
then
then
the
you had
Globetrotters, and
that
then
really
the Josie one. Yes.
with
Now,
the
did
with
in general, didn't the ones on major labels, like that was on Capitol, do better than say the Chattanooga Cats, which is on what, One Way or some
forward. It
Forward?
was
That's what it was. I knew it was
yeah,
some title like that. Mike
yeah,
Curb's label, and
absolutely.
he did a Hardy Boys thing too, I think, or not Hardy Boys, Hot
No, that
Wheels
was
or
hard.
Hot
Yeah,
Wheels, Hot Wheels. That's what he
Hot
did.
Wheels.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. Hot
and
Skyhawks. Yeah.
so I mean, we're at, a lot of these at the whim, like because Decca was a bigger label. Why Banana Splits might have done better as a record, or was just that show more popular than Chattanooga Cats in general?
I think both. I think I
Okay,
don't I think Chattanooga Cats had, and by 69, you look at those comic book ads and stuff, or go on Wikipedia seeing 60, 68 and 69 and 70, that was the Silverman era where he was really gaining power.
yeah,
And I think whatever was on against Chattanooga Cats, which may have been Scooby Doo,
that
um,
probably was.
was because, to be honest, that was an hour, and to be honest with you, I didn't watch Chattanooga Cats,
Yeah,
and I did, and I wish it was available
yeah,
a little bit on YouTube, because It's the Wolf is a great cartoon.
yeah.
It was first when it's a funny cartoon, and the look of that is almost a Patty Freeling-ish.
Hmm.
I mean, we're still, and the look of Chattanooga Cats in general is very different. You
Hmm.
know, songs are real cool. So I wish I knew more of it and could access, and maybe we will. We can
Yeah,
only, because to me, Hanna-Barbera did so much material that it's almost brand new to not. I mean, to me even,
yeah,
as well, people who are younger who will say, what's CB Bears and all that.
yeah. Now that
You know,
Chattanooga Cats album, I don't know if you have it there, but I mean that's one I never see cheap. And I don't own it because of that. I've never seen it lower than like $100, and sometimes I'm willing to pay up to that and plop down that type of money. But I, at the time I saw it at that, I was like, well, this is like a lesser Hanna-Barbera thing. It was just my thinking at the time, and there were so many things I hadn't owned. Now at this point, if it was $100 or even a couple hundred, I might plop down for it. But I'm not rushing. But anyway.
well, it would be nice if licensed, legitimate versions were made available
Yeah,
somehow.
and that's another thing. I was hoping they
Other
reissued
than
it.
it's just like anything else. There's going to be lots of not official, and um, there's money to be made. Maybe not enough, but I think as time goes by, I never say never. Look at
Yeah,
the miracle of MeTV Tunes.
right.
There there are markets for this. It just takes ingenuity and the embracing of the changing viewing patterns. And if you go back into the 20th century, I just learned, I'm reading a book about vinyl records, the story of records. And the record companies were terrified of radio,
Mm,
terrified of radio in the 20s, because the records didn't sound as good as,
hmm.
systems radio played over, and radio was free. And they thought they'd be destroyed by it. There's always this like huddle into a scared bunker about any new technology, or there's an over embracement of one that they all seem to hop onto this tiny pin with no room on it, and then they overspend on something that
Hmm.
they think this is going to be it. And I think that's human, and I think that that's not necessarily illogical. What is illogical is there's room for other platforms. There's room for other initiatives. They have to broaden what their priorities are, and level the
Hmm.
things instead of just going in one direction. I mean, what mistakes were made in the late 60s with all the musicals? It was like, let's spend a fortune. And it became how much money you could spend instead of how good the movie was. And I like a lot of those. I like Dr. Dolittle, and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang wasn't highly respected at the time. Maybe in
Right.
England it was, but mostly all they looked at was this movie would cost too much and too much money was spent. Well, there were a whole lot of details in like Camelot that didn't even need to be there, like the foliage and stuff
Yeah.
that would have saved. And Annie too, having the real fish in the fish market. How much do you have to go overboard spending money to not and then neglect other
Yeah.
more important things? But what ended up happening? They all, the boat sank, and they all went for lifeboats, and it's weird. It's weird, these phases. It's just that excuse me, the thing you have to do most is just listen.
Yeah.
Just get, and there are people who can also listen for you, but you have to trust those people to not have their own agendas, and that's tricky as well.
Hmm. Now, interestingly, we always, and I said this at the top of the show, so Hanna-Barbera gets the rap, oh, there was nothing good after Scooby-Doo, which
Yeah,
is
I know.
not true, which is not true. But, and we've discussed this before on a previous episode. We did a Hong Kong Phooey on your podcast and things like that, which I think is one of their greatest shows and still do. But
And I
it's
don't know
great.
if you heard, I had Kathy Gorey on a couple of
Yes, I
weeks.
did. Yeah, yeah. That was great.
What was
Yeah.
that? It was hello, hello. I mean, that
Yeah.
was that.
Hello, hello. Anyway. Uh, but anyway, going back to the Hanna-Barbera records, it's kind of ironic that about the same time, and I don't know if it was just the nature of children's records as an industry anyway across the board, but Disney kept doing pretty well through the 70s. But like by 73, and I read about this on Ron Dante's uh, Funhouse CD set. I don't know if you have that.
Mhm.
He puts the songs from the Amazing Chan and Chan Clan that he recorded on there. And they sound just like Archie's songs. I mean, they might as well have been Archie's songs because it's just Ron Dante singing again. But um, he said that they toyed with an idea of putting out a Chan Clan album and then decided not to. I mean, was the state of the industry by 73, at least for Hanna-Barbera, I mean, that was the same year as the Charlotte's Web. But also, Sesame Street was pretty strong with record albums. Disney certainly was still strong with record albums. What was changing that Hanna-Barbera from that point on? I mean, and you don't, and it's not really, I mean, it's in the book, but I mean, it's not like you can see it in the book. I mean, the book throughout the 60s, lots of issues, lots of stuff coming out over and over. And then after 73, well, you get like a Heidi song soundtrack, and then you get into the reissue box sets that Earl Kress put together, Picnic Basket and things like that, and then the sound effect records and all the other stuff that are more nostalgic rather than I mean, you have a few. You have a Snorks record, you have a Smurfs record, but like they didn't put out like the Dukes or Fonz and the Happy Days Gang in outer space or whatever. I mean, a lot of those are TV tie-ins, but there weren't soundtrack albums to these or of any sort by that point. What do you think changed for Hanna
Oh,
Barbera?
has changed, especially what kids were into changed, and also the way the industry worked changed. The I think the idea of the bubblegum pop band, that was never embraced by the industry. The Monkees to this day, you know, uh,
Yeah,
the living and past, still are unfairly criticized for not being real when so many pop artists use the Wrecking Crew. And talking to Ron Hicklin, he augmented an awful lot of pop singers and things too. Not electronically either. He would stand next to them and sing with them. Sometimes the other voice you heard wasn't the same voice.
mm-hmm.
Sometimes, um, so it was always, everything in the entertainment industry is a construct, and has it is somewhat artificial. Once it's reproduced, it becomes something, a thing, a product, and all kinds of elements are, a whole team of people make that product. But I don't think the Monkees ever really were respected. And even now, Head has become considered an art classic, and a seminal film because of what came after it, and also because I don't think people got it the way they do now.
Mhm.
But at the time, they were, and I think that I do know that and Ron Dante can confirm this, it was hard to get a DJ to play a cartoon band's record. Hanna-Barbera's drop-ins was handy mostly because, and they were very shrewd in doing this, the little snippets of dialogue are funny, and
Yeah.
you can slip in, and DJs did that at will. I worked at a radio station in Fort Lauderdale, a rock station, and I brought in these records, and we were putting in little bits and pieces of dialogue, and a song from Chattanooga Cats because it was so weird and stuff. But they did it for comedy. But as
Yeah.
far as promoting a cartoon song, it was almost like the Monkees. We're pure, and there's a purity, and that's
Yeah.
why a lot of rock critics, that whole attitude. Rock and roll became more of an art form and was more respected in the late '60s because the Beatles had developed from a mop top, Bobby Soxer kind of thing, not Bobby
Yeah.
Soxer, Screaming Girls to now they're creating these art albums, these
Yeah.
album formats and things. So that the industry, when it comes to bubblegum, bubblegum was an alternative. It was a brilliant alternative.
Yeah.
And cartoons fell into that. And bubblegum wasn't respected much either,
No.
but it certainly sold well. Well,
Yeah.
suddenly you've got something that's a combination of both. So with the Archies, they were putting either no label or some other label on Sugar Sugar to get it played, and the public loved it. So they kind of slipped it in between the
Yeah.
cracks.
Well, they certainly didn't put a picture sleeve on that one. It was just on a plain
No,
calendar record or Kirshner record. I forgot which label it's on because it's that same label, but
think about it. You're absolutely right. Every successive Archie's album got more to look like an RCA album and
yeah.
didn't emphasize the group and emphasize them as artists, but not as a cartoon, because the first album was a picture of the Archies.
Right.
Second album, they were on the guy's shirt. The
Hmm.
album had those little toy things, those whole click together toys.
Yeah.
And then the fourth album, to me, looked more like a standard RCA pop
Yeah.
album.
Sunshine. Yeah.
With Sunshine, because the Archies were real small and the picture was huge. And then This Is Love, which
Yeah.
tied into Love Story, which we were talking about before the show, had these gardenias on the cover and couples surfing and stuff. So it was even farther away. And that's their least known album. It's actually quite a good album and really isn't all romantic songs. It was odd how that was marketed.
I know.
Because it's pretty much an Archie album, but it was because of that. Now, according to the excellent liner notes in the Rhino Josie thing, Josie and the Pussycats was going to be what the Archies weren't, a real group of performers that toured. And that's why the ladies on the covers sang the songs, obviously they were rotoscoped for a lot of the animation. That's Cheryl Ladd waving Melody's hair around. And terrific singers, all three of them, and especially Grace Holloway, who, if that had happened, she might have been a breakout star, because everybody in the whole industry loved her because she was one of those people that was known and respected, but just didn't have the fame. And Capitol dropped the ball. Capitol didn't want to do it for whatever reason. He didn't know, Danny Jansen. He didn't know why that was, but they just dropped the ball. And it may have been that aversion that we don't do cartoon thing. So little by little, Hanna-Barbera was not licensed, was not even, Ron Dante told me that there wasn't even much talk about it being an album. It was just going to be for the show. Because when you do contractual agreements for any kind of a piece of entertainment work, and I know this also from Disney, if an attraction or a live show or a fireworks extravaganza, if the music is not in the contract for commercial recordings, it has to be done later, and it's expensive. But it's expensive to begin with. So sometimes if their budget doesn't allow for it, they don't do it. And that's why sometimes a wonderful show that people embrace, and they say, well, why isn't there anything on a CD? It's because it wasn't negotiated at the time.
Yeah.
And that's what happened with I think these shows is it's like, we don't want to invest the money in the recordings. We're not going to get. And I remember walking up and down the aisles when Jabberjaw was on in the serial,
Yeah.
or a record on the back of a box, or Send Away.
Yeah.
Thinking, gotta. Jabberjaw was so far away from that it just was never going to happen. And you'll also notice that the songs got shorter on Josie and the Pussycats in Outer Space. That's a different set of 10 songs. It's produced differently, and those don't play all the way through. So they started cutting them. Partridge Family, 2200 AD.
Yeah.
One of those songs was on one of their albums. The rest of them were made for the show. On all the ones made on the show were done for the show and were all short on the show.
Were
And
those still Cassidy and Jones singing, or
no,
do you?
no.
Okay, I didn't think so. Okay.
And the songs for Archie's Funhouse. This is something I didn't know and I'd known Ron Dante for a long time, but we never got around to this subject till he did the podcast. Those songs and some of them are on his album,
Right.
Love Vibrations, Puppet on a String, the very late Archie's Funhouse songs. It's like, why weren't these on LPs? Because those was a different set of songs specifically made for the show, not for records. If you listen to them, there is not much instrumentation. It was not produced by Jeff Barry. It was done strictly for Filmation, and their shortness was deliberate. Just like they just don't. They just end. There are
Well,
no.
it's like the U.S. of Archie, which I don't even think had Ron Dante at all, and
No.
so it's there is an album out there, but I think it's mainly a needle drop from the cartoon
I
too.
think it is. I don't think that album is legitimate. I can't. I know the one. It's like the Boulevard Nights or something. Or
No, no, well, no, it's a real album. It's on Peter
the
Pan or
U.S.
something.
of Archie
Yeah,
album.
U.S. of Archie album. Yeah, Ron's not on that,
The Peter Pan album it's like the old Colpix. It's
yeah.
just the tracks
Mm.
and very kind of not particularly good sound effects, and a small combo just going U.S. of Archie, hey hey hey,
Yeah.
and then very little music, somebody strumming an electric guitar. But the cool thing is there's no other vinyl record with that cast as the Archie cast on it.
Right.
So,
Eh,
something.
I liked it.
So,
Well, see, that's what I wanted as a kid. I wanted those type of albums. That's why I was like, "Where's the Hong Kong Foo album? Where is
well,
it?"
one is that one, and this is in the book too. When Hanna-Barbera Records folded, according to a Warner list I have, and according to Billboard articles, there were a handful of albums still planned, and the Impossibles, I believe, was ready to go because I have a 10-inch demo of Hitty Hitty Who and She Wouldn't Dance. And so that was as close as it could come to being an album, but it didn't happen. So I do think that, if somebody out there I'm not going to reveal them all because it's in the book, but somebody out there that wanted to do the Space Ghost album that was mentioned in Billboard that may exist on a master tape, please do so, because it never saw the light of day. How incredible is that? A brand new album with, or maybe one with Dawes Butler doing Yogi.
Do you know if any of this stuff's in the vaults or anything, or you don't know? You have no clue.
Well, according to the some yes, some no.
Okay.
I explained it in the book. Some are mentioned in the article, but I don't see them in the master list. Some are on the master list and probably have master recordings. They just never got pressed, and there's probably no album art. Though there's one that Joe Bevilacqua seems to recall Dawes giving him a test copy of. But I said, what did the cover look like? He couldn't recall, and he doesn't have it anymore. So it's altogether possible there wasn't a cover, but maybe they press it, because they do that. And I think that's Yogi Bear's. No, Rough and Ready, Gulliver's Travels. That's all I'm going to tell you. Those two.
Okay.
Rough and Ready, Gulliver's Travels. Cool, huh?
Yeah.
But it didn't happen. So
yeah. Of course, we're struggling trying to get reissues of the stuff that did come out. So it's like, that would be icing on the cake if those came out.
They never, because we never. Who knew we'd be doing a Zoom and we'd be doing this right now.
Right.
Nobody except the Jetsons knew, and Gloria lost her face.
Sorry.
Poor Gloria lost her face. Yes.
Okay,
but
one thing. Well, let me ask you one thing about the book itself. So this is a promo copy or advanced
right,
copy. It doesn't have the index. Is everything else in it that's supposed to be in it, or is there still any revisions that still need to be made?
there's a few typos, and there were factual revisions, and there was a few reordered paragraphs that I felt like, it makes better to mention this here and there. So there were details that
Hmm.
were proofed by their proofer, by my wife Suzanne, who is a saint,
Hmm.
and she truly is the guiding force of the book, because not only did she say just get in there and write it, but
Good for
it's
her.
feasible in our lives for this book to be written. It's not easy to write a book. It's not easy to have the time to write a book. It's not easy to have the circumstances surrounding doing a book. You know this better than I do, because you go to live a life,
I don't have a
and
life.
well, you're to a degree, but a book is not a cash cow unless you're going to write the story of my life by Taylor Swift,
Yeah.
or something
Or
like
you
that,
have a massive marketing campaign behind it,
and,
which we don't.
you know and and this is not talking out of school. Mousetracks was published by University Press of Mississippi with Disney's um, knowledge, because I work there, but I also would never. I was not one to ever do anything that they didn't know about, because that's not the kind of hairpin I am. It's not the way my dad raised me.
Yeah.
And so whenever I was doing anything in addition to my work, I said, here's what I'm doing in addition to my work. And they said, it's fine. Or they
Yeah.
said, fine, fine. And I found out it was fine. And I went all the way up to the top of the ladder sometimes, because I wanted to do things right. Mousetracks is the rule at Disney is, if you write a book, and Lord knows, Imagineers have written the books while they work there, and artists have, and many people. The rule is, first of all, yeah, you've got a job to do. Second of all, um, if you do anything, it cannot be a conflict. Third of all, it has to be approved by legal, which Mousetracks was not only approved by legal, but by merchandise.
Hmm.
And uh, and the publishing Disney Press, or whichever the banner they go under, has to have first refusal. And they just felt it was too niche of a title. They're very supportive. They've always
Hmm.
been very supportive. They just felt like it was, and of course it is. So is this book, you
Yeah.
know. But they deal in, again, they're a huge organization. They deal in huge numbers, and
Hmm.
that's the same reason why you're not seeing a lot of these niche recordings from Disney, is because
Right.
they can't they can't they can't turn on the lights for 1,000 copies. They have a huge overhead, and they have to, and I think, and I honestly think it will take time, but I think that will change, because Warner proved you could do it. But it
Hmm.
took it, and as you can hear on several of my podcasts, and I just did one with the archive guys, and they said it too. It takes support from the decision makers to support the idea of long tail economics, so that you can definitely and successfully, to a huge degree, with very low cost, supplement the business, the bottom line. It's never going to be top, it's never going to be the top stuff.
Hmm.
But when you need revenue, find a way to do this, because it's sitting there, audience, and the audience is usually out there, clamoring for it. But it isn't, just like this book. I don't have illusions that you know, I'm going to be on the Tonight Show with it. I'm on your show, which I find really,
Oprah's best.
I if it was Johnny, maybe that would be
Yeah.
kind of cool, but um, it's not that kind of book.
Yeah.
But it's Hanna-Barbera as a whole
Hmm.
is worthy of a whole lot more attention, and there has only been attention to a small area of something that's much bigger, you
Yeah.
know. And a lot of generations have grown up with, and a lot of other people have been inspired by, and have used their templates and their models, and some of their people,
Hmm.
to have what we have now, that wouldn't exist without what these people did.
Okay. Couple more questions before I let you go, because we've been talking for
Oh
a
gosh,
while.
been on. Oh,
Almost 2 hours. Uh, let's see. The book itself, did you have to, you talked about getting approval from Disney. Did you have to get any similar approval with this book or no?
Well,
I mean,
it's a
it's
little
not Disney, but Warner Brothers might say or
it's
whatever. Yeah,
let me put it this way. Um, it's not the same,
yeah,
but I wrote a book just like Mousetracks. I wrote a book that was very Warner friendly.
hmm
That I want, just like Mousetracks, I wanted a book that everybody could be proud of and enjoy. Um, that wasn't rose-colored glasses because then you're insulting your readers too, and they can smell that. Because I
right.
used to be a copywriter, and it's like you better be organic with whatever you're trying to present as best you can, because if you just force things in, then people are going to go birdcage with this ad,
Yeah,
and it's not always easy to do that. But I tried to write it from the standpoint of how viable all this material is, not necessarily an Adamant album with LBJ jokes, but just how viable this history, this legacy, this material in general, this library, these characters, what they did, how relevant
yeah,
they are and probably mostly will be, even if it takes on other forms. I worked for many years in marketing, and this is a brand, and I was very faithful to the brand and
okay,
what decisions were made then and why. And so you read it, that I wrote and rewrote carefully. Here's why this decision was made. Here's why this is best as I could,
yeah,
and also why it's important. Why, without it being a stretch
yeah,
of, oh come on, it's not that. No, it really is. And so I wanted, and so far the response has been very, very positive.
yeah.
Um, George has read it and
Oh,
likes it. That's enough for me,
okay,
because this book is extremely in line. I don't know if anybody at Me TV Tunes has yet, but I think it's in line. I didn't even know about that then, but in line with that too. It's all part of the effort we're all doing,
yeah,
that we don't want to indulge ourselves and, here's what I like, here's what I like. That's, to a certain degree, we all do because we do like it.
yeah,
But that's the difference between a historian and a fan,
yeah,
or, is that you also want to convey the substance and the business sense and the marketability and the brand, all that stuff, the strategies. That's why when I was explaining to you, when you said why did they pick the titles they did at the beginning? Brand new label. What are they going to do? What's the market?
yeah.
It's
Makes
marketing.
sense.
It always is. It always
Mhm.
is. So it is a business book, because Mousetracks was about a business and how hard it was to get Walt and Roy to agree to start this business, how it struggled, how it, and then Jimmy Johnson's book was about the various businesses he did and how he developed direct marketing. In a way, this is kind of that book too, but I don't write that way because I don't like reading books like
Yeah,
that.
well, I mean, you write the way I do. It's like I'm
Yeah,
writing for myself.
yeah,
And I know writers, and I'll mention a couple: Steve Cox, Jim Corcus, Leonard Maltin, which you actually did your introduction. They write the way Jerry Beck. They write the way I like to read,
yeah.
friendly, accessible, not too scholarly or hoity-toity with a zillion
No,
footnotes. And it's like, no, just read, present the facts, present them factually, I guess, educationally, but also entertainingly as well. So,
oh yeah, and there's a
and that's
couple of
what you do too, and that's what I like.
there's a
So that's why I
couple
like this
of,
book.
I mean, there are, it's my book by the references and the asides and the kind
Yeah,
of thing.
yeah,
In fact, with William Castle, I compare him to William Shatner, because
yeah. It's
it's a
fine.
very Shatner-esque
Yeah,
kind of performance,
yeah,
and immediately you're going to know. But that was the intent. I want as many people to be adult. I didn't want. And this is hard too. Same with Mousetracks. You don't have to ever listen to any of these records ever,
right.
because I didn't want to get bogged down in synopses and then the this is, it does this, it does this, it does this, unless it was pertinent. I tried not to do that,
Right.
because it's people may never hear them, may never be able to afford them, they may not be on YouTube, and plus they may not care.
Yeah,
So I tried to give them a contextual reason for existing every single time. and why they're fascinating, but not just a total recap of them one by one, because that's also not what University Press would have wanted, you know. And they I gotta say, they, God bless them, they trusted me
Hmm.
to do this because it did get approved. Um, and I didn't have to do sample chapters and things like that because they knew what Tim and I had done
Hmm.
before.
Yeah.
And I can't praise them enough because
Hmm.
they're very, I think they're very excited by it too.
Hmm.
And what it the good that it'll do. You know, we want to celebrate how cool this. You know, there's just so much about, and it's not that it's, like I said, it's not all just dancing through daisies, but it's so fun. Why don't we just have some fun? You
Yep,
know,
exactly. Well,
yeah,
you've written a
cartoons
fun
were,
book.
you know,
um,
Fooey was a fun show, and that's
yes.
all it was about. It's
Yep,
fun.
yep, yep, yep. We'll do another hour on that.
Well,
Anyway,
you know, one because we should, because I was listening. What was I watching this morning? Goober and the Ghost Chasers.
yeah.
Yeah, it sure is Scooby Doo. It's but what makes it different from Scooby Doo, and what were the circumstances? Well, it's on ABC, who couldn't have Scooby Doo yet, you know,
Right,
and
right.
all of that stuff, and it has different voices, and it's still, you know, it's something to talk about, and it has its own history.
Yeah.
So there's, and Laugh Olympic. I'm Mike, who Lyons, who I mentioned, one of his favorites.
Hmm.
That's a boy when that hits um, Me TV Tunes. Forget it. You know, that's, and there's not that many of them
Well,
because
Laugh
remember,
Olympics is kind of Wacky Race's reboot in a certain
exactly, yeah.
respect. It
So bad.
has the classic characters, but I mean, it's the same idea.
What
Dream
Wacky Race
teams.
kind of, but Wacky Race is the race and the gimmick cars and all that, and then they stop it to have sort of a little misadventure kind of thing, you know,
Hmm.
some kind of a little storiette in there, you know, and the various Roadrunner-esque kind of things that Dastardly's doing, and they weave that all together. That's what keeps you watching. Laugh Olympics was almost like a live show, like which Battle of Network Stars wasn't either, but it felt live because it was
Yeah,
on tape. This, if you could put a cartoon on tape, you would do that with this
right.
because it was a sports broadcast and it had interviews with
Hmm.
various people and it, you know, archival footage and, you know, and even not Galaxy Goop Ups, Yogi Space Race,
Yeah.
it had game show prizes and it gave away trips and it had mini commercials in it. So yeah, there is similarities, but they tried really hard because, you know, these were professional people. They didn't want to churn out. You know, you did your best
Yeah.
to and so there are some wonderful aspects to each one of those things.
Hmm. All right. The inevitable question at this point is, but you'd probably say, well, years from now, I don't know. No. What's next for Greg Ehrbar book-wise? Is there one in the planning? Again, can you talk about it?
Well, I don't really want to say because I don't know if I'll do it.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
you know, there's a lot of transition going on in my life right now.
Fair
You
enough.
know, my kids graduate college, and you know, we're looking at where are we going? Where do we all fit in all of this? What's, you know, my wife and I, what's our plan?
Hmm.
And I think that focusing on this book for the next, you know, for quite some time, focusing on the podcast, because the podcast I never even thought that was going to be a thing, and that's kind of become something very close to me because there's been so much said on it and so many interesting people like you who we've explored things beyond the book. Um, so I never expected that. We got 39 episodes now, and they're divided in. So if you count all the pieces, there's even more than that.
Yeah.
And so I do have some things I've pitched, but we haven't settled on anything. Quite honestly, we haven't settled on a thing. Right
Hmm.
now, we got to focus on, you know, I got Comic Con next week. I don't know when you're running this, but in a Comic Con panel next
It'll be
week.
after
Uh,
that. Yeah,
no,
I'm probably into August or September right now, and I'll explain why in
well,
a minute. But go.
Comic Con starts with something.
Yeah.
Hope that goes well. Hope that when everybody sees this, that I'm still, you know, excited, you know, that it all worked out. And because it's kind of a cool thing. and various interviews, and just, you know, kind of like focusing on this for now,
Yeah.
and what supports this, because like I said, this is not the book I started out writing. This is not the sort of effort that I thought was, I feel, really kind of important,
Yeah.
um, in our little circle, perhaps, but so what? You
Yeah.
know, it's taken on a life of its own. So I kind of want to see where it goes from here.
Right.
And, everybody listening or watching, you tell me, because,
Yeah. Well,
you know,
I will. No, what I'd like to see from you, seriously, since you're such the expert, but two things. One is, going down further on children's music, of other artists or things that have a healthy catalog. I mean, Sesame Street could be the obvious one. Uh, maybe
and
other cartoon
great. That's a
maybe
great.
other cartoon characters, say Bozo, Popeye, whatever, that had pretty extensive catalogs, Captain Kangaroo, but all in one book and not just a single book on the. And then, the more obvious one, because you're doing it, and I've used material from this very podcast to do this for my own books, is some sort of Hanna-Barbera book coming out of your podcast. I don't know what that would be, you
You know
know,
what? True.
transcribed interviews or whatever. I mean, it's easier nowadays to transcribe an interview than it used to. Honestly, there is a positive use on AI technology, which I've learned. So, you know you still have to go through it, but it saves you the tedium of forward, 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 rewind, rewind, forward, forward. You can just listen to it in real time and mainly correct the mistakes as you see them and stuff like that. So, but anyway,
Yeah.
stuff like that. So, I mean, that's what I see as a book that might be interesting coming from your podcast
True.
because it's your own stuff. Yeah. So who
Maybe
knows?
in oral history, that would be an oral history, like, that there's a great Saturday Night Live book that does that. That's
Yeah.
those books are, and I'm sure they're very difficult to do, but, and I have acknowledged the both TV Confidential and Stu Show. TV Confidential has been very supportive of the book, and Stu Show has been a gold mine of interviews, because Stu Shostak was the sole seeker out of a lot of these people. So if you go back into his archives, there is a wealth of stories and recollections and stuff that's still there. And
Yeah.
then you got all the commentaries, and I used a lot of the commentary material. So that's a good idea. That's a good idea, and maybe a thing about records based on cartoons. That's never been a book either.
Yeah.
Um, Might be kind of a fun thing, which is what animation spin is, to a degree too. And the thing that I'm proudest of with Animation Spin is that, um, I wanted these records to be, I told Leonard Maltin this. I said, I'm totally copying your format from the Disney films. The date when it's released, the credits, the song. He said, go right ahead.
Yeah.
I'm
Well, that's what I did with my Disney book,
Yeah,
you know, and I even
yeah,
say so in the first page. I say, this is to pick up where his left off because I wanted
exactly,
to cover the stuff after Walt died, So
exactly.
yeah,
That's the Frozen in Time book. Yeah.
yeah,
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 well, and more needs to be said about, now you see him, now you don't. It's a great movie.
yeah.
It's
There you go.
and it, but great effects and stuff, and what a cast.
Right.
Anyway, um, yeah, that's what Animation Spin does, but it also takes these, and it's the same with cartoons until the 70s, until people like Leonard Maltin, Jerry, and John Canemaker, and people like that. Cartoons were not getting the treatment of, here's what they are, here's what their history is, here's their artistic merit, here's who was behind them. That's what I wanted to do with the Animation Spin, and that was this area of children's records. But it would be nice. I don't know what kind of market there would be for a book on Golden or Peter Pan records. Sesame Street is a great idea too, because
Yeah.
they really made some outstanding, and they got a lot of Grammys as well. They made
Hmm.
some outstanding things. Some of them have been reissued, some not. Um, and they had a finite period as well, because they just pretty much stopped. The CDs came later, but
Yeah.
as far as LPs, they kind of just stopped,
Yeah.
when cassettes and CDs came. But that's a great idea as well. But that there are certain labels that I revere very highly, and all the ones we mentioned
Hmm.
are so, there's so much to them.
Yeah.
And I've talked with a guy named Bill Smith who is a tremendous authority on Golden, and he has and it's come close again with getting some of those things out there. And he knew members of the Shimkin family and Arthur Shimkin and
Hmm.
people like that that pioneered it. But it can't be underestimated the impact they had, because they were the first really massively successful independent children's label before Disney. They were doing Disney's records before Disney was. Mickey Mouse Club one stuff.
Hmm.
And then they did Hanna-Barbera in the 60s,
Hmm.
and so, and then they kept changing, that's interesting too. It's all out there. Um, like you've given me a couple of wonderful thoughts too. Some of them we've discussed and some of them we haven't.
Yeah.
Um, I think the response to this may say what it is, and we'll see. But
Yeah,
I
well, that's
wanted,
fine. I'm just throwing little bugs
I
out there. People do it to me all the time. They say, "What about a book on this?" And it's
yeah.
like, well, sometimes I'm like, "Yeah, okay, let's do it." And then sometimes I'm like, that would be a great book that I'd love to read, but I don't want to write it. It's like, and that's usually what
Oh,
something
yeah.
could, yeah,
Case, because you've got to be get so close to the subject matter that you're living with it. And I said this on Stu show too. Not once have I become bored with watching the cartoons,
mhm.
listening to the records. It is never. I mean, it can be tedious,
Yeah,
Lord
yeah,
knows, but not boring,
no,
and not to where if I have to listen to Golden Cartoons and Song Volume 3 again, no, I still do.
yeah,
I honestly do enjoy listening to them, and that
mhm.
helps an awful lot when
Yes,
you're going through this material, and even the later ones. And speaking of the 70s, there wasn't a Scooby Doo album in America until 77,
right,
and the only one was that British one, which is also a very strange one, the Snowman
yeah,
Monster one, Snowman
yeah.
Menace. Very odd album.
My
It
favorite
totally
Scooby Doo
compared to,
album, I'll just say it. I mean, it's the one that came out later that had the Davy Jones track and all the different song tracks from the
Snack
earlier
Track.
episodes. But when did that come out? It was like 20 years after the show debuted, at least. So it's like,
Yeah, and but there will be another Rhino.
yeah,
Just there will.
yeah,
So often you just never know, and it's like, okay, they go back 20 years or whatever was a generation. I don't think that's the case now. I think
mm,
things are much more fragmented than
yeah,
they ever were, and I also think that because of access, they can't direct. And I know this from presentations on millennials and stuff. They
yeah,
can't always direct attention to what they want to direct attention to like they used to in
mm,
marketing, because there's an infinite number of choices, and people of all ages have the freedom to seek out things that they just think are cool. And it
yeah,
doesn't matter when they were made, doesn't matter if they're color or black and white, doesn't
yeah,
matter if they were alive then. And
right,
when I was a kid, and I'm sure when you were a kid, I thought movies from the 50s, the 30s, 40s, 50s were cool. When I first discovered Lullaby at Broadway, whoa, what the heck is that? I was into old radio shows,
yeah,
by my teens. I didn't go, oh, that wasn't my era.
yeah,
I went, oh, I want more. I want more Fibber McGee and
yeah,
Molly.
yeah.
It's like that's what people really do.
I was hoping, and it actually came true when I was a kid. Can't these films look better? I mean, they're all scratched and faded and cut and blah blah blah. And then now Blu-ray and 4K and everything. And I'm like, that's what I wanted,
Well, you
Same
know,
thing with the records, it's like, we're talking about, putting on an old Hanna-Barbera records,
yeah,
CD or streaming or whatever, it's like, yay, you know.
that's true. That's
So,
true, and that's the same again. Back to TCM and MeTV Tunes and Disney Plus and a lot of those other. They're showing high reses of and 4Ks and all that stuff that you can see that you can't necessarily, if you don't have the machines, play in a lot of cases. And we grew up with pink copies of Tom Thumb. Having that, just getting a decent DVD of that, and Gulliver's Travels. My
right.
goodness, the one that Steve Stanchfield did, with on Blu-ray,
Hmm.
it was like I've never seen this movie before because
Yeah.
I saw it in theaters when it was pink and red
Yeah.
and it had a million splices in it, and I still loved it. But seeing them this way, there, you can say all you want about things not being what they used to be, but we could have never dreamed the accessibility that we have.
Right. Right.
Instead of dwelling on what we don't like or what, why is this or why is that, it's like use your time by just watching the cool stuff you love because it's almost all out there, not all of it. And that's another famous Facebook. Why isn't this? Why isn't that? Well, chances are you can find somewhere. And if you can't, then watch this. You
Right.
know,
Right.
it's like there's always something. We have almost too much. And
Yeah.
that's the challenge also with businesses too, is because there's so much that even with $1 million marketing budgets, cutting through all of that and getting things noticed is extremely, extremely difficult because people are going where they want to go. And YouTube is probably the best example of that.
Yeah.
You want to see this, and then you go, is this movie somewhere on YouTube or is it on a streaming service? Then you go to watch.com or whatever, and you seek it out. And when I watch a movie, I go to Wikipedia. I read the history as best as it's described. I usually look at the trivia on IMDb, and then they inevitably mention some connecting thing. And then I go right to the streaming services or whatever and see, can I get it? Can I buy it? Is it on YouTube? I think a lot of people do that who enjoy doing it, and I don't think it's age exclusive. And that's the world.
Right. Well, I thank you again, Greg Ehrbar, for being
For this
my guest. We
long-winded.
always talk go long, but that's okay. I guess give a quick plug again for the book,
Oh,
and
I,
also,
yeah, let's plug the book. And
and
also,
how, if people need to get in contact with you, have questions, you know.
there's gregavision.com is my website. And I have a email address on there. It may or may not change, but give it either way, you can get in touch with me. You can also find me on Facebook. And even if I think you can message either way, you can always message me that way. I look at those. I look at comments, and I always, I do. And also, please, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the Fantastic World of Hanna and Barbera podcast. It's on all the streaming services: Amazon, Apple Music, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and others. And it's going to. That's another thing. When I set out to do it, who else is doing an Hanna-Barbera podcast?
Well,
Nobody.
I didn't know this one would last this long. I figured I'd do it a couple of years, and here, 6 years later, I'm still doing it, almost 300 episodes. So.
I know, and I'm approaching a year.
Yeah.
In August, it'll be a year. Who knew? I didn't know how it was going to go or how
Yeah.
it was developed, and how much people really enjoy either talking about their lives there,
Mm.
or what it means to them, or how it's people who had no connection, how it affected them, and folks like you and Mike who can really dig deep into a specific thing. I try to mix it up because it's so cool that it's fun to do that. So I try to keep it a variety of things. And if you like any specific thing, say I want more of this, more Hong Kong food. Why don't you
More Hong
talk
Kong fooey.
to
Can't have
Lister?
enough.
Does that mean Warner Brothers owns Dr. Lister?
More Dr. Lister.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right. Well, I will end it here, and I'm sure you'll be on the show again for some reason, probably another book, or we'll just, do another Hanna-Barbera show, or who knows? We talk cartoons. We could do a Sesame Street show. Hey,
That'd be
anyway, all right. So this is my special guest, Greg Ehrbar. He's been on before. Go in the archives and find those, and also listen to his podcast, 39 episodes as of this date, and This is Mark Arnold on the Fun Ideas podcast. Plenty of episodes in the back vault too there. So, and you can also listen to Stu shows. I'll give him a plug too. Why not? There's about 600 episodes of those,
And
probably.
TV Confidential also, because I do
TV
TV.
Confidential. I don't know how many episodes they have, but they're a couple hundred too, I
Oh,
think.
100.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, so all right, and we will see you next time. This is Mark Arnold, your host, and we'll talk to you soon.